She's dying, and so is the baby. Those were the first words that cut through Caleb Rourke's mind when he found her. A woman collapsed beside a shattered wagon wheel, her face white as bone, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Blood stained the frozen ground beneath her. The wind howled across the Wyoming emptiness like a warning. No town, no help, just him. Most men would have ridden past. Caleb didn't. If you want to see how far one choice can change everything, stay with me until the end. Hit that like button, drop a comment with your city, and let's see how far this story travels. The wind came hard across the Wyoming flats, carrying with it the kind of cold that didn't just bite, it gnawed. It worked its way beneath collars, through gloves, into the marrow. Caleb Rourke had felt worse, but not often. He pulled his coat tighter and kept his horse moving at a steady walk, eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of shelter. The sky was bruised purple and gray, the kind of sky that promised snow before nightfall. He'd been riding for 3 days straight, drifting between rail camps and mining outposts, picking up work where he could, and moving on when the work dried up. That was the rhythm of his life now. Movement without destination, work without meaning. It had been that way since the war ended, since he'd come home to nothing and decided that nothing was easier to carry than something. The land stretched out in every direction, vast and indifferent. Caleb had grown used to its silence. He preferred it most days. Silence didn't ask questions. It didn't remind him of what he'd lost or who he'd failed. Out here, a man could disappear into the emptiness and forget he'd ever been anything other than wind and dust. But then he heard it. A scream. Faint at first, almost swallowed by the wind, but unmistakable. Human, desperate. Caleb reined his horse to a stop and listened. The wind shifted and the sound came again, sharper this time, edged with pain and panic. It was a woman's voice, and it was close. He turned his horse toward the sound and nudged it into a trot. The flatland dipped into a shallow draw, and that's where he saw it. A wagon, tilted at an awkward angle. One wheel snapped clean off. The canvas cover was half torn, flapping uselessly in the wind. A single horse stood nearby, tangled in its traces, eyes rolling white with fear. And on the ground beside the wagon, barely visible in the failing light, was a woman. Caleb dismounted and approached cautiously. The woman was young, maybe mid-20s, with dark hair matted to her face and skin so pale it looked translucent. Her hands were pressed against her swollen belly, and her breath came in short, desperate gasps. Blood seeped through her skirt, darkening the frozen earth beneath her. "Jesus," Caleb muttered, dropping to one knee beside her. Her eyes flew open, wide, wild, and filled with terror. "Help me," she whispered. "Please, help me." "Easy," Caleb said, keeping his voice low and steady. "I'm not going to hurt you. What happened?" "The wagon hit a rock." She gasped, her whole body seizing with pain. "The baby, it's coming." Caleb's stomach dropped. Of all the things he'd expected to find out here, this wasn't one of them. He looked around, hoping against hope that there might be someone else nearby, another traveler, a settlement, anything. But there was nothing, just the two of them, the dying light and the cold. "Where's your husband?" he asked. Her face crumpled. "Dead. 3 weeks ago, fever." Her voice broke. "I was trying to reach Fort Laramie, but the wheel, I couldn't." Another contraction tore through her, and she cried out, arching her back. Caleb caught her shoulders to keep her from thrashing. "All right, listen to me," he said firmly. "My name's Caleb. I'm going to help you, but you need to stay with me. You understand?" She nodded weakly, tears streaming down her face. "What's your name?" "Mara," she gasped. "Mara Whitlock." "All right, Mara, we're going to get through this." He had no idea if that was true. Caleb had seen men torn apart by bullets, blown to pieces by cannon fire, left to die screaming in muddy trenches. He'd stitched wounds, set broken bones, pulled shrapnel from flesh. But this? This was different. This was life trying to claw its way into a world that didn't want it, and death waiting just on the other side. He pulled off his coat and laid it beneath her, then grabbed his bedroll from his saddle and spread it over her legs for warmth. The temperature was dropping fast, and if the baby didn't kill her, the cold would. "How long have you been having contractions?" he asked. Since this morning," Mara panted. "They were far apart, but now—" "They're close," Caleb finished. He could see it in the way her body tensed, the way her breathing quickened. All right, this baby's not waiting. Mara's eyes filled with fresh panic. I can't. I don't know how. You don't have to know, Caleb said, his voice cutting through her fear like a blade. Your body knows. You just have to let it work. He didn't know if that was true either, but it sounded right, and right now, that was all he had. The next hour was a blur of pain, blood, and cold. Caleb worked by instinct, doing what he could to help Mara through each contraction, keeping her focused, keeping her breathing. The wind howled around them, and the first flakes of snow began to fall, dusting the ground in white. I can't do this, Mara sobbed at one point, her voice breaking. I can't. Yes, you can, Caleb said sharply. You've made it this far, haven't you? You've survived losing your husband, survived alone on this trail, survived the wagon wreck. You're not going to quit now. She looked at him through tear-blurred eyes, and something in his words must have reached her because she nodded and gritted her teeth. That's it, Caleb said. Stay angry. Anger keeps you alive. The contractions came faster, harder. Mara screamed, and the sound echoed across the empty land. Caleb braced her, his hands steady even as his mind raced. He'd delivered foals before, calves, even a litter of pups once. But a human baby? That was a different kind of responsibility. It's coming, Mara gasped. I can feel it. All right, when the next one hits, you push as hard as you can. Don't hold back. The contraction came, and Mara pushed, her scream tearing through the night. Caleb saw the crown of the baby's head, slick and dark, and his heart slammed against his ribs. Again, he urged. You're almost there. Mara pushed again, her whole body trembling with effort. The baby slid free into Caleb's waiting hands, tiny and covered in blood and vernix. For a terrible moment, it didn't move, didn't cry. Caleb's hands moved on instinct. He cleared the baby's nose and mouth, turned it over, and gave it a firm pat on the back. Once, twice, and then a wail. Thin, reedy, but strong, the baby filled its lungs and screamed its existence into the frozen Wyoming night. It's a girl, Caleb said, his voice rough. He wrapped the baby in his shirt and handed her carefully to Mara. Mara's face, pale and streaked with sweat and tears, transformed. She cradled the baby against her chest, and for the first time since Caleb had found her, she smiled. Eliza, she whispered. Her name is Eliza. Caleb nodded, but his relief was short-lived. Even in the dim light, he could see the blood still flowing from Mara, soaking into the bedroll beneath her. Too much blood. Mara, I need you to stay awake, he said, his voice sharp with urgency. Her eyes fluttered. I'm so tired. I know, but you can't sleep yet, not yet. He worked quickly, doing what he could to slow the bleeding, but he was no doctor. He was just a man with rough hands and limited knowledge, and he was running out of options. The snow fell harder now, covering the ground in a thin white blanket. The wind cut through Caleb's thin undershirt, and he shivered violently. He needed to get them out of the open, but where? The wagon was wrecked, the horse half wild with fear. There was no shelter for miles. And then he heard it, a low rumbling growl from somewhere in the darkness. Caleb froze. He turned slowly, scanning the shadows beyond the firelight. 2 yellow eyes gleamed back at him, low to the ground, then 2 more, and 2 more. Wolves. Of course. Blood drew predators, and they'd bled plenty. Caleb stood slowly, positioning himself between the wolves and Mara. He pulled his revolver from its holster, the metal cold against his palm. Stay back, he said quietly, though he knew they couldn't understand him. The wolves circled, their eyes fixed on the baby's cries. Hungry, patient. Caleb fired a shot into the air. The crack echoed across the flats, and the wolves scattered, but not far. They melted back into the darkness, just beyond the reach of the firelight, waiting. We can't stay here, Caleb muttered. But moving Mara in her condition could kill her just as surely as staying put. He made a decision. He'd drag what was left of the wagon into a rough barricade, keep the fire burning, and hold the line until dawn. Then, if Mara was strong enough, they'd move. The night stretched on, long and brutal. Caleb fed the fire, kept his gun ready, and listened to the wolves prowling just beyond the light. Mara drifted in and out of consciousness, the baby wrapped tight against her chest. Every time Mara's eyes closed, Caleb shook her awake. "Not yet," he said. "You don't get to quit yet." She looked at him with exhausted, hollow eyes. "Why do you care?" Caleb didn't answer right away. He stared into the fire, his face hard and unreadable. "Because somebody has to," he said finally. The wolves tested the perimeter twice more before dawn, and both times Caleb drove them back with gunfire. He was down to 3 bullets. When the first gray light of morning finally crept over the horizon, Caleb felt a grim satisfaction. They'd survived the night, but survival was only the first step. Mara was weaker now, her skin clammy and pale. The baby, Eliza, was quiet, too quiet. Caleb checked her breathing and found it shallow but steady. She needed warmth, real warmth. A fire and a blanket weren't enough. Caleb scanned the horizon and saw it. A smudge of dark smoke rising in the distance. A settlement, maybe. Or a rail camp. "We're moving," he said. Mara didn't respond. Her eyes were closed, her breathing slow. Caleb cursed under his breath. He gathered what he could, blankets, water, the baby, and fashioned a makeshift sling to carry Eliza against his chest. Then he lifted Mara as gently as he could and laid her across his horse's back. The horse shifted nervously, but Caleb steadied it with a firm hand. "Easy, girl. We're all we've got." He took the reins and began walking, leading the horse toward the smoke. The wind picked up again, carrying with it the bite of a coming storm. Snow began to fall in earnest now, thick and fast, covering their tracks almost as quickly as they made them. Caleb's legs ached. His hands were numb. The baby whimpered against his chest, and he tucked the blanket tighter around her. "Just a little farther," he muttered, though he didn't know if that was true. The smoke grew closer, and Caleb's heart lifted, until he saw what was waiting for him. 3 men on horseback, blocking the trail. They were rough-looking, dressed in mismatched coats and wide-brimmed hats. One of them had a rifle across his saddle. Another had a revolver holstered at his hip. The third man, older and scarred, grinned when he saw Caleb. "Well, well," the scarred man said. "What do we have here?" Caleb stopped walking. His hand moved slowly toward his gun. "Just passing through," he said evenly. "Passing through with what looks like a mighty heavy load," the man said, his eyes flicking to Mara and the baby. "That your woman?" "None of your business." The scarred man chuckled. "Everything out here's my business, friend. Now, why don't you hand over whatever you got worth taking, and we'll let you walk away." Caleb's jaw tightened. "Not gonna happen." The man's grin faded. "Then I guess we got ourselves a problem." Caleb's hand closed around the grip of his revolver. 3 bullets. 3 men. This was going to be close. The scarred man raised his rifle, and Caleb moved. He drew and fired in one smooth motion, the bullet catching the rifleman square in the chest. The man toppled backward off his horse with a strangled cry. The second man went for his gun, but Caleb was faster. His second shot took the man in the shoulder, spinning him sideways. The scarred man spurred his horse forward, drawing a knife. Caleb fired his last bullet, but the horse jerked at the wrong moment, and the shot went wide. The scarred man was on him in seconds, slashing with the knife. Caleb threw himself to the side, feeling the blade whistle past his ribs. He grabbed the man's wrist and twisted hard, and they both went down into the snow, grappling. The man was strong, wiry, and mean. He got his knee into Caleb's stomach and drove the air from his lungs. Caleb fought to hold on to the knife hand, but his grip was slipping, and then, crack! The scarred man went limp. Caleb shoved him off and looked up to see Mara sitting upright on the horse, holding a broken piece of wagon wood in her trembling hands. Blood dripped from the makeshift club. She stared at the unconscious man, her eyes wide and glassy. "Did I?" she whispered. "You saved my life," Caleb said, breathing hard. Mara dropped the wood and swayed. Caleb caught her before she fell. "Easy," he said. "Easy. You're all right." But she wasn't. Her eyes rolled back and she slumped against him. Caleb looked at the bodies in the snow, at the baby still crying against his chest, at the storm closing in around them. And he started walking again, because that's all there was left to do. The smoke had been a lie. Not a settlement, not a rail camp, just the smoldering remains of what looked like an abandoned trapper's shack, half collapsed and blackened by an old fire. Caleb stood in front of it, snow gathering on his shoulders, and felt the weight of everything pressing down on him at once. Mara was unconscious, draped across the horse like a rag doll. The baby, Eliza, had gone quiet again, her tiny body warm against his chest but unnervingly still, and somewhere behind them, in the swirling white chaos of the storm, 2 wounded outlaws might still be alive, might still be coming. Caleb looked at the shack. It wasn't much. 3 walls standing, part of a roof still intact, a stone chimney that might still draw smoke. But it was shelter, and shelter was more than they had now. He led the horse closer and tied it to a post that looked ready to collapse. The animal nickered nervously, its breath steaming in the freezing air. Caleb ran a hand along its neck. "I know," he muttered. "I don't like it either." He lifted Mara down as carefully as he could and carried her inside. The interior was dark and smelled of char and decay, but at least the wind couldn't reach them here. He laid her on the dirt floor, arranged blankets beneath and over her, and checked her pulse. Weak. Thready. But there. The baby stirred against his chest and let out a thin, pitiful cry. Caleb unwrapped her just enough to check her color. She was pale, her lips faintly blue, but her eyes were open and tracking movement. That was something. "All right, little one," he said quietly. "Let's get you warm." He stepped back outside into the storm and began gathering what he could find, broken planks from the shack's collapsed side, pieces of an old barrel, anything that would burn. His hands were so cold they barely worked, his fingers stiff and clumsy. Snow plastered his hair to his forehead and melted into his eyes, blurring his vision. By the time he got back inside, he was shaking violently. He built a fire in the old stone hearth, coaxing it to life with hands that trembled so badly he nearly dropped the matches. But finally, blessedly, the flames caught and began to spread, crackling through the dry wood. Heat radiated outward, and Caleb sank down beside the fire, cradling Eliza close. For a few minutes, he just sat there, letting the warmth seep into his bones, listening to the storm howl outside. His mind was blank, emptied by exhaustion and cold. He didn't think about what came next. He didn't think about the outlaws, or the miles still to travel, or the fact that Mara might not make it through the night. He just breathed. Eliza whimpered, and Caleb looked down at her. She was so small, fragile in a way that terrified him. He'd held dying men in his arms, watched the light go out of their eyes, and never felt this kind of helplessness. Those men had made their choices. They'd walked into war knowing what it cost. But this baby? She hadn't chosen anything. She'd been born into a frozen hell without a say in the matter, and now her survival depended on a drifter who didn't know the first damn thing about keeping an infant alive. "Your mama needs to wake up," Caleb said softly, "because I don't know what I'm doing here." Eliza blinked up at him, her tiny fingers curling and uncurling. Behind him, Mara stirred, a faint groan barely audible over the crackling fire. Caleb turned quickly. "Mara?" Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused and glassy. "Where?" "We're in a shack," Caleb said, moving to her side. "Storm's bad. We had to stop." She tried to sit up, but her body wouldn't cooperate. She sagged back down, her face twisting in pain. "Eliza? She's right here." Caleb shifted so Mara could see the baby bundled against his chest. "She's all right." Mara's eyes filled with tears. Let me hold her." Caleb hesitated. Mara looked half dead herself, her skin waxy and pale, her breathing shallow. But the desperation in her eyes was something he couldn't ignore. He knelt beside her and carefully placed Eliza in her arms. Mara clutched the baby to her chest and broke down, her whole body shaking with sobs. "I thought I'd lost her," she whispered. "I thought—" "You didn't," Caleb said firmly. "She's here. You're both here." Mara looked up at him, tears streaming down her face. "You saved us." Caleb shook his head. "You're not saved yet." It was a hard truth, but it was the truth. They were alive, yes. But alive wasn't the same as safe. Mara's face fell, and she looked down at Eliza, stroking the baby's cheek with a trembling finger. "I don't know how to do this," she said quietly. "I don't know how to keep her alive out here." "Neither do I," Caleb admitted. "But we'll figure it out." Mara met his eyes, searching for something. Reassurance, maybe, or hope. Caleb didn't know if he had either to give, but he held her gaze and didn't look away. "Why are you helping me?" she asked finally. Caleb didn't answer right away. He turned back to the fire, watching the flames dance and flicker. Why was he helping her? He'd spent the last 5 years avoiding exactly this kind of entanglement. He'd walked away from people, from places, from anything that might anchor him to the world. And yet here he was, risking his life for a woman and a baby he didn't know. "Because nobody else is," he said at last. It wasn't a complete answer, but it was the only one he had. Mara was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Thank you." Caleb nodded but didn't reply. The baby began to fuss, and Mara winced. "She's hungry," she said. "I need to—" She tried to adjust her position, but the movement made her cry out in pain. Fresh blood seeped through the blankets beneath her. Caleb's jaw tightened. "You're still bleeding." I know," Mara said through gritted teeth. "I can feel it." "You need a doctor." "There's no doctor out here." Her voice was flat, resigned. Caleb stood and paced to the broken wall, staring out at the storm. The snow was coming down so hard he couldn't see more than a few feet. Even if there was a town nearby, they'd never reach it in this. And if he left Mara and the baby here while he went for help, they'd be dead before he got back. He turned back to her. "How far were you from Fort Laramie?" 2 days, Mara said. "Maybe less. I don't know anymore." 2 days. In good weather, on a clear trail, that was manageable. But in this storm, with Mara barely conscious and a newborn in tow, it might as well have been 200 miles. "There's a rail line west of here," Caleb said, thinking aloud. "Runs between Cheyenne and Laramie. If we can reach it, we can flag down a train." "How far?" "A day's ride. Maybe more in this weather." Mara closed her eyes. "I won't make it." "You don't know that." "Yes, I do." She opened her eyes and looked at him with a terrible clarity. "I can feel it, Caleb. I'm dying." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. He wanted to argue, to tell her she was wrong, but the blood soaking through the blankets told a different story. "Then we move faster," he said harshly. "We leave at first light, and we don't stop until we hit that rail line." "And if I die before we get there?" "You won't." Mara's laugh was bitter and broken. "You can't promise that." "No," Caleb said, "but I can damn well try." She held his gaze for a long moment, and then she nodded, too exhausted to argue. Caleb fed more wood into the fire and settled down against the wall, his revolver resting across his lap. He didn't trust the storm to keep the wolves at bay, and he trusted the outlaws even less. If they were smart, they'd have turned back. But desperate men rarely made smart choices. The night crawled by in fits and starts. Caleb dozed off a few times, jerking awake at every sound. The creak of the shack settling, the wind rattling the loose boards, the distant howl of a wolf. Each time, he checked the fire, checked on Mara and Eliza, and forced himself to stay awake a little longer. Around midnight, Mara woke again, her voice thick and confused. "Thomas?" Caleb moved to her side. "It's Caleb." "Thomas," she said again, her eyes unfocused. "Where's Thomas?" "Mara, Thomas is gone. It's me, Caleb." She blinked, and recognition slowly returned. "Oh," she whispered. I dreamed." "It's all right." She looked down at Eliza, still asleep in her arms. "She looks like him," Mara said softly. "She has his eyes." Caleb didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing. "We were going to start over," Mara continued, her voice distant. "Build a farm, raise our children somewhere safe." She laughed, a sound edged with hysteria. "Safe? What a stupid dream." "It's not stupid," Caleb said. "It is when you're bleeding to death in a burned-out shack in the middle of nowhere. You're not dead yet." Mara turned her head to look at him. "Do you ever get tired of fighting, Caleb?" The question caught him off guard. He thought about the war, about the years since, about the endless days of just surviving. Did he get tired? Every damn day. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I do." "Then why keep going?" "Because the alternative is worse." Mara considered that, then nodded slowly. I suppose you're right. She closed her eyes again, and Caleb thought she'd drifted off. But then she said, "If I don't make it, will you take care of her?" Caleb's throat tightened. "You're going to make it." "But if I don't?" He looked at the baby, so small, so helpless, and felt a weight settle over him that was heavier than anything he'd ever carried. "Yeah," he said finally. "I will." Mara's hand found his and squeezed weakly. "Promise me." "I promise." She let out a slow breath and seemed to relax, as if that promise had been the only thing keeping her tethered. Caleb sat with her until she fell asleep, then returned to his post by the wall. The storm raged on outside, unrelenting. Dawn came gray and cold. The storm still raging, but with slightly less fury. Caleb stood and stretched, every muscle in his body screaming in protest. He checked on Mara and found her awake, staring at the ceiling with hollow eyes. "How do you feel?" he asked. "Like I'm dying," she said flatly. Caleb didn't argue. He helped her sit up, gave her water, and wrapped Eliza more securely in blankets. The baby was fussing again, her cries weak but persistent. "She needs to eat," Mara said. "Can you?" "I'll try." Mara managed to nurse Eliza, though it clearly cost her. By the time the baby was finished, Mara was trembling and drenched in sweat. Caleb got her back onto the horse, secured Eliza in the sling against his chest, and took the reins. The storm had eased enough to see a few hundred yards ahead, and Caleb oriented himself by the position of the sun, faint and pale behind the clouds. But there. They set out into the white. The going was brutal. The snow was knee-deep in places, and the horse struggled with every step. Caleb walked ahead, breaking a path, his legs burning with effort. Mara swayed in the saddle, barely conscious. By midday, they'd covered maybe 3 miles. Caleb called a halt in the lee of a rocky outcrop and checked on Mara. She was slipping in and out of awareness, her lips tinged blue. "Mara," he said sharply, shaking her shoulder. "Stay with me." Her eyes opened, but they didn't focus. "So cold," she murmured. "I know. Just hold on a little longer." He wrapped her in every blanket they had and gave her the last of the water. Eliza whimpered against his chest, and Caleb tucked her deeper into the coat to keep her warm. They pushed on. The landscape stretched endlessly in every direction, white and featureless. Caleb's sense of direction began to blur. Was he still heading west, or had he veered north, south? The sun was hidden now, swallowed by fresh clouds, and the wind erased their tracks almost as quickly as they made them. He kept walking because there was nothing else to do. And then, just as the light began to fail again, he saw it. A line in the snow, straight, deliberate, rails. Caleb's heart leapt. He quickened his pace, dragging the exhausted horse forward. The rails emerged fully from the snow, iron tracks cutting through the wilderness like a promise. But there was no train, no station, just the empty rails disappearing into the storm. Caleb sank to his knees, the weight of despair crashing down on him. They'd made it. They'd reached the line. And it didn't matter, because there was nothing here. Mara slid off the horse and crumpled into the snow. Caleb scrambled to her side. "Mara!" She didn't respond. He pressed his fingers to her neck and felt the faint, irregular flutter of her pulse. She was still alive. Barely. Eliza began to cry, and the sound cut through the storm like a blade. Caleb looked down the empty rails, then back at Mara's pale, lifeless face. And then he heard it. A whistle. Faint. Distant. But unmistakable. A train. Caleb surged to his feet, pulled his revolver, and fired a shot into the air, then another, and another, until the gun clicked empty. The whistle came again, closer now, and through the swirling snow, Caleb saw the dark shape of a locomotive bearing down on them, its headlamp cutting through the storm like a beacon. He waved his arms, shouting, though he knew they couldn't hear him over the noise of the engine. The train began to slow. Caleb dropped to his knees beside Mara, his hands shaking. "You hear that?" he said, his voice breaking. "We made it. We made it." Mara's eyes fluttered open, just for a moment. She looked at him, and the faintest ghost of a smile touched her lips. Then her eyes closed again. The train screeched to a stop, and men began jumping down from the cars, shouting questions Caleb couldn't process. Someone took Eliza from his arms. Someone else lifted Mara onto a stretcher. Caleb tried to follow, but his legs gave out. He hit the snow hard, and the world tilted sideways. The last thing he heard before the darkness took him was the sound of Eliza crying, strong and alive, carried away into the warmth of the train. When Caleb opened his eyes, the world had gone soft. Not the brutal white of the storm, not the sharp edges of frozen earth and splintered wood, but the warm amber glow of lamplight dancing across wooden walls. He blinked, disoriented, his mind struggling to catch up with his senses. Warmth. He felt warmth. Real warmth, seeping into his bones, chasing away the cold that had lived inside him for what felt like forever. He tried to sit up, and pain shot through his chest and shoulders like lightning. "Easy there, friend." A hand pressed him back down, firm but not unkind. "You've been out for near 12 hours. Your body's not ready for gymnastics just yet." Caleb turned his head and saw a man in his 50s, weathered face lined with hard living, wearing the uniform of a rail company conductor. The man held a tin cup, steam rising from it. "Where am I?" Caleb's voice came out as a croak. "Passenger car on the Union Pacific westbound," the conductor said. "You flagged us down in the middle of a damn blizzard with a dying woman and a newborn baby. Don't remember that part?" It came back in fragments. The rails, the whistle, Mara collapsing, Eliza crying. Caleb's heart lurched. "The woman, Mara, is she—" "Alive," the conductor said quickly. "Barely. We've got her in the next car with the doc working on her. Lost a hell of a lot of blood, but she's still breathing." "And the baby?" "Squalling like a barn cat last I heard. She's a fighter, that one." Relief hit Caleb so hard it left him dizzy. He closed his eyes and let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "Here." The conductor pushed the tin cup into Caleb's hands. "Drink this. It's just broth, but it'll help." Caleb took the cup and sipped. The liquid was hot and salty and tasted like life itself. He drained it in 3 swallows. The conductor nodded approvingly. "Name's Frank Hastings. I'm the head conductor on this line. You got a name?" "Caleb Rourke." "Well, mister Rourke, you've caused quite a stir. We don't usually stop in the middle of nowhere for anything short of a derailment, but when Jennings up in the engine saw you firing off rounds, he figured it was either bandits or someone in serious trouble. Lucky for you, he chose to stop instead of plow through." "I need to see her," Caleb said, pushing himself up despite the pain. "Mara, I need to, Whoa, hold on." Frank put a hand on his shoulder. "Doc's still working. Best thing you can do for her right now is rest and let him do his job. I promised her, and you'll keep that promise, but not if you keel over dead from exhaustion." Frank's voice softened. "Look, son, you did the hard part. You got her here. Now let us do ours." Caleb wanted to argue, but his body had other ideas. He sank back against the makeshift bedding, his strength gone. "How long until we reach a town?" he asked. "We'll be pulling into Bitter Hollow in about 3 hours. It's not much, mining town, maybe 300 souls, but it's got a doctor, a boarding house, and supplies. We'll get your people settled there." "They're not my people," Caleb said automatically. Frank raised an eyebrow. "Could have fooled me." Caleb didn't respond. He stared at the ceiling of the passenger car, listening to the rhythmic clatter of the train on the rails. The motion was soothing, hypnotic. His eyes drifted closed. He woke to the sound of raised voices. Caleb sat up, instantly alert. The pain in his body was duller now, manageable. He swung his legs off the bench and stood, swaying slightly, then moved toward the source of the commotion. In the next car, he found a scene of controlled chaos. Mara lay on a makeshift table fashioned from 2 benches pushed together, her face deathly pale, her body covered in blood-stained blankets. A man in shirt sleeves and a vest, the doctor, Caleb assumed, was bent over her, his hands working quickly. 2 women stood nearby, one holding Eliza, the other assisting the doctor with bandages and tools. Frank Hastings stood off to the side, his arms crossed, watching with a grim expression. "What's happening?" Caleb demanded. The doctor didn't look up. "She's hemorrhaging again. I've done what I can to stop the bleeding, but she's lost too much blood. If we don't get her stable soon, she'll die," Caleb finished. "Yes." The word hung in the air, heavy and final. Caleb moved closer, and the doctor finally glanced at him. "You the one who brought her in?" "Yeah." You a medical man? No, just a... Caleb hesitated. What was he? A drifter. A killer. A man who'd seen too much death and not enough life. Just someone who was there, the doctor grunted. Well, you did better than most. She'd be dead already if you hadn't kept her warm and moving, but she's not out of the woods yet. Mara's eyes fluttered open, glassy and unfocused. Eliza, she whispered. Where's... She's right here, ma'am. The woman holding the baby stepped forward, safe and sound. Mara's gaze found the baby, and tears spilled down her temples. Let me see her. The doctor shook his head. You need to stay still. Please, Mara begged, her voice breaking. Please. The doctor looked at Caleb, then at the woman holding Eliza, and sighed. Just for a moment. The woman brought Eliza close, and Mara reached out with a trembling hand to touch the baby's cheek. Eliza stirred, her tiny mouth opening in a yawn. She's beautiful, Mara whispered. Isn't she beautiful? She is, Caleb said quietly. Mara's eyes found his. You kept your promise. Not done yet. She smiled faintly. You will. The doctor cleared his throat. All right, that's enough. She needs rest. The woman carried Eliza away, and Mara's hand dropped back to her side. Her eyes closed, and for a terrible moment, Caleb thought she was gone. But then her chest rose and fell, shallow but steady. The doctor straightened and wiped his hands on a rag. She needs a proper bed, proper care, and more blood than I can give her. Best we can do is keep her comfortable and hope she's strong enough to hold on until we reach Bitter Hollow. And if she's not? Caleb asked. The doctor met his eyes. Then you'd better start thinking about what comes next. Caleb turned away, his jaw tight, and walked to the end of the car. He stared out the window at the passing landscape, endless white giving way to patches of scrub and rock as the train descended into lower country. The storm was breaking up, the clouds thinning to reveal a pale, washed-out sky. Frank joined him, offering a cigarette. Caleb took it and let Frank light it for him. They smoked in silence for a while. You thinking about running? Frank asked eventually. Caleb glanced at him. Why would I run? Because that's what men like you do when things get complicated. I've seen it before. Hell, I've done it before. She's not my responsibility. Maybe not, but you made her your business when you didn't ride past that wagon. Frank took a drag and exhaled slowly. Question is, what are you going to do now? Caleb didn't answer. He didn't have an answer. The train rolled on and the hours passed in a blur of waiting and worry. Caleb stayed close to Mara's car, watching the doctor work, watching the women tend to Eliza, watching Mara hover between life and death. At one point, one of the women, a middle-aged matron with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, approached him with Eliza in her arms. She's hungry again? The woman said. And her mama's in no shape to nurse. You got any ideas? Caleb stared at the baby, feeling helpless. There's a goat in the livestock car, the woman said. We can try goat's milk, see if she'll take it. But someone's got to hold her while I fix the bottle. Caleb hesitated, then held out his arms. The woman placed Eliza into them, and Caleb found himself holding the tiny squirming bundle for the second time in as many days. Eliza looked up at him with wide, dark eyes, Thomas's eyes, Mara had said, and let out a small, pitiful cry. Yeah, I know, Caleb muttered. I'm not your first choice either. The woman chuckled. You're doing fine, Mr. Rourke. Just keep her warm and don't drop her. She disappeared into the next car, leaving Caleb alone with the baby. He sat down on a bench and adjusted his hold, trying to mimic the way Mara had cradled her. Eliza fussed for a moment, then settled, her tiny fist closing around Caleb's thumb. Something shifted in Caleb's chest, a crack in the armor he'd spent years building, a sliver of something he didn't want to name. You're making this real complicated, kid, he said quietly. Eliza yawned. The woman returned with a bottle of warm goat's milk, and Eliza drank greedily, her cries subsiding into contented gulps. By the time she finished, she was asleep, her small body relaxed and trusting in Caleb's arms. You're a natural, the woman said with a smile. Caleb didn't reply. He just stared down at the sleeping baby and wondered what the hell he'd gotten himself into. The train whistle blew, loud and shrill, and Frank's voice echoed through the car. Bitter Hollow! 5 minutes to Bitter Hollow! Caleb stood, still holding Eliza, and made his way back to Mara's side. She was awake, her eyes fever-bright, her breathing labored. "We're almost there," he told her. "I can't feel my legs," she whispered. The doctor looked up sharply, his expression grim. He checked her pulse, lifted the blankets, and swore under his breath. "What?" Caleb demanded. "The bleeding's worse. She's going into shock." The doctor looked at Frank. "We need to get her off this train now. Have a stretcher ready the second we stop." Frank nodded and hurried off. Mara's hand found Caleb's, her grip weak. "Take care of her," she said, her voice barely audible. "Promise me." "You're going to take care of her yourself," Caleb said fiercely. "You hear me? You're not done yet." "Caleb, no. You don't get to quit. Not after everything we've been through." Mara's eyes filled with tears. "I'm so tired." "I know, but you hold on. Just a little longer." The train began to slow, the brakes screeching. Through the window, Caleb saw the rough outline of Bitter Hollow, a scattering of buildings huddled against the base of a low mountain, smoke rising from chimneys, lanterns glowing in the dusk. The train lurched to a stop, and the doors flew open. Men swarmed in with a stretcher, lifting Mara with practiced efficiency. Caleb followed, still holding Eliza, as they carried her off the train and into the cold evening air. A crowd had gathered, miners, townsfolk, curious onlookers. Frank was shouting orders, directing the men toward a building at the end of the street. Caleb caught up to him. "Where are we taking her?" "Doc Mercer's place. He's the town physician. Best shot she's got." They moved quickly through the muddy streets, past saloons and supply stores and a church with a crooked steeple. Doc Mercer's house was a 2-story structure with a sign hanging above the door. The men carried Mara inside, and Caleb followed, his boots tracking mud across the clean wooden floor. An older man with silver hair and spectacles looked up from a desk. "What's all this?" "Emergency, Doc," Frank said. "Woman's hemorrhaging bad. She needs help now." Doc Mercer's expression shifted instantly from annoyance to focus. "Bring her to the examination room. Clear the table." The men obeyed, and within seconds, Mara was laid out on a table under bright lamplight. Doc Mercer washed his hands, rolled up his sleeves, and went to work. "Everyone out except you," he said, pointing at the train's doctor. "I'll need an extra pair of hands." Frank herded Caleb and the others out into the hallway. The door closed behind them, and the waiting began. Caleb paced the narrow hallway, Eliza still cradled in his arms. The baby had woken and was staring at him with those 2 knowing eyes. "Your mama's tough," Caleb said quietly. "She's going to pull through." He wasn't sure who he was trying to convince, Eliza or himself. Time stretched. Minutes felt like hours. Caleb's legs ached, but he didn't stop pacing. Frank sat on a bench, smoking another cigarette. The kind woman from the train had followed them and now sat knitting, her needles clicking rhythmically. Finally, the door opened. Doc Mercer stepped out, his sleeves stained with blood, his face drawn. Caleb's heart sank. "She's alive," the doctor said, and Caleb's knees nearly gave out. "But it was close. Closer than I'd like. I've stopped the bleeding for now, but she's lost a dangerous amount of blood. The next 24 hours will tell us if she's strong enough to recover." "Can I see her?" Caleb asked. "Briefly. She's sedated, but she might wake. Don't stay long. She needs rest more than anything." Caleb handed Eliza to the knitting woman and stepped into the examination room. Mara lay on the table, cleaned up and covered with fresh blankets, her face still pale, but somehow less deathly. Her chest rose and fell in a slow, steady rhythm. Caleb pulled a chair close and sat down. He didn't touch her, didn't speak. He just sat there, watching her breathe, feeling the weight of everything settle over him. She'd survived the wagon wreck, the childbirth, the wolves, the outlaws, the storm, the train ride. She was still fighting, and so, Caleb realized, was he. He stayed until Doc Mercer came back and quietly shooed him out. In the hallway, the knitting woman returned Eliza to him. "There's a boarding house down the street," she said. "Mrs. Calloway runs it. She's got a soft spot for strays. Tell her Margaret sent you." "Thank you," Caleb said. Margaret smiled. "You did a good thing, Mr. Rourke. Don't let anyone tell you different." Caleb left the doctor's office and stepped out into the night. Bitter Hollow was quiet now, the streets nearly empty, the saloons glowing warmly in the distance. Snow had begun to fall again, soft and gentle this time, drifting down like ash. He found the boarding house easily, a sturdy building with a painted sign and lace curtains in the windows. He knocked, and a stout woman in her 60s answered, eyeing him warily. "Mrs. Calloway?" Caleb asked. "Who's asking?" "Margaret sent me. I need a room, for me and—" He gestured to Eliza. Mrs. Calloway's expression softened instantly when she saw the baby. "Oh, you poor dears, come in, come in." She ushered him inside into warmth and the smell of fresh bread. She led him to a small room upstairs with a bed, a chair, and a washstand. "I'll bring up some blankets for the little one," she said, "and some food for you. You look half-starved." "Thank you." Mrs. Calloway paused at the door. "That baby's mother, is she all right?" "She's alive," Caleb said. "That's all I know." Mrs. Calloway nodded. "Then we'll pray she stays that way." She left, and Caleb sank onto the bed, still holding Eliza. The baby had fallen asleep again, her breathing soft and even. Caleb looked down at her and felt the exhaustion of the past 2 days crash over him like a wave. He'd kept his promise. He'd gotten them here. But the fight wasn't over yet. Caleb woke to the sound of gunfire. He was on his feet before his eyes were fully open, his hand instinctively reaching for the revolver that wasn't there. He'd left it downstairs with Mrs. Calloway for cleaning. The shots came again, sharp and distinct, echoing through the quiet morning streets of Bitter Hollow. Eliza wailed from the makeshift cradle Mrs. Calloway had fashioned from a drawer and blankets. Caleb scooped her up, his heart hammering, and moved to the window. Dawn was just breaking, painting the sky in shades of gray and pink. Below, in the street, he saw them. 3 riders. Dust-covered, hard-faced, weapons drawn. The outlaws. Caleb's blood turned to ice. He'd thought they were done. Thought the wounded men had turned back or bled out in the storm. But here they were, and they'd tracked him somehow. Tracked Mara. Or maybe they'd just followed the rail line, gambling that their prey had made it to the nearest town. One of them, the scarred man Mara had clubbed, sat slumped in his saddle, a blood-stained bandage wrapped around his head. The other 2 looked fresh, mean, and ready for trouble. Caleb heard voices below, Mrs. Calloway's among them, high and frightened. Then a man's voice, rough and demanding. "We're looking for a man and a woman. Woman just had a baby. They came in on the train yesterday." "I don't know what you're talking about," Mrs. Calloway said, her voice shaking. "Don't lie to me, old woman. We tracked them here. Now where are they?" Caleb didn't wait to hear more. He wrapped Eliza tightly in a blanket, grabbed his coat, and slipped out of the room. The boarding house had a back staircase. He'd noted it the night before out of habit, always marking exits, and he took it now, moving as quietly as he could. He reached the ground floor and found Mrs. Calloway's kitchen empty. His revolver sat on the table, cleaned and oiled, along with a box of ammunition. Caleb grabbed both, loading the gun with hands that were steady despite the adrenaline surging through him. He heard boots on the front porch, the door being kicked open. "Search the place," the scarred man ordered. Caleb moved to the back door and eased it open, slipping out into the cold morning air. Eliza whimpered against his chest, and he pressed a hand gently over her, willing her to stay quiet. He couldn't go to Doc Mercer's. That's the first place they'd look. And he couldn't lead them to Mara, not when she was helpless, barely clinging to life. He needed to draw them away. Caleb circled around the side of the boarding house, keeping low, and spotted his horse in the small stable behind the building. Mrs. Calloway had stabled it there the night before, fed and watered it. The animal nickered softly when it saw him. "Good girl," Caleb whispered. He secured Eliza in the sling across his chest, tightened the straps, and swung into the saddle. Behind him, he heard shouting from inside the boarding house. They'd found his room empty. Caleb didn't give them time to regroup. He spurred the horse forward, bursting out of the stable and into the street at a full gallop. The outlaws turned at the sound, and Caleb saw the recognition flash across the scarred man's face. "There!" he roared. Gunfire erupted. Bullets kicked up dirt around the horse's hooves, whistled past Caleb's head. He leaned low over the saddle, one arm wrapped protectively around Eliza, and rode hard toward the edge of town. Behind him, the outlaws mounted up and gave chase. Bitter Hollow was a small town, and Caleb cleared the last of the buildings within seconds. Open country stretched ahead, rolling hills dotted with scrub and rock, patches of snow clinging to the shadowed places. The morning sun was rising fast now, burning off the last of the mist. Caleb's horse was strong, but it was carrying double weight, him and the baby. The outlaws' horses were fresher, and they were gaining. Caleb risked a glance back and saw them closing the distance, their faces set with grim determination. The scarred man raised his rifle. Caleb yanked the reins hard to the left, and the shot went wide, the bullet whining past his ear. He veered into rougher terrain, guiding the horse up a rocky incline where the footing was treacherous, but the pursuit would be slowed. The horse scrambled over loose stones, its breathing labored. Eliza cried, a thin, terrified sound that tore at Caleb's heart. "I know, kid," he muttered. "I know." He reached a narrow ravine and plunged down into it, the horse sliding on the loose scree. At the bottom, a frozen creek cut through the landscape, its surface cracked and treacherous. Caleb guided the horse along the edge, looking for cover, for anything that might give him an advantage. He found it in the form of an old rail shack, probably abandoned when the line shifted routes. It was half collapsed, barely more than 3 walls and a sagging roof, but it was shelter. Caleb dismounted, pulled the horse inside, and tied it to a broken beam. He checked Eliza. She was red-faced and wailing but unharmed, and set her down in the driest corner he could find, wrapping her in every layer of blanket he had. Then he took up position behind the remains of a window frame, revolver in hand, and waited. The outlaws arrived within minutes, their horses picking their way down into the ravine. They spread out, cautious now, weapons ready. "We know you're in there, Rourke," the scarred man called. "Or whatever the hell your name is, you got something that belongs to us." Caleb didn't respond. He steadied his breathing, sighted down the barrel of his revolver, and waited. "We don't want trouble," the man continued. "We just want what's ours. You hand over the woman and the kid, and we'll let you ride out of here." "Like hell you will," Caleb muttered under his breath. One of the other outlaws, a younger man with a patchy beard, edged closer to the shack. Caleb tracked him through the broken window frame, finger resting lightly on the trigger. "She had money," the scarred man said. "That woman. We saw it before the wagon wrecked. A strongbox. That's all we want. The money. You give us that, and we'll leave you be." So that's what this was about. Not revenge. Not justice. Just greed. Caleb's jaw tightened. Mara hadn't mentioned any money, but then again she'd been a little preoccupied with dying. If there had been a strongbox, it was long gone, buried in snow or scavenged by wolves. "There's no money," Caleb called back. "You're lying. Think whatever you want. There's nothing here." The scarred man spat into the dirt. "Then I guess we do this the hard way." He made a gesture, and the 3 men dismounted, spreading out to flank the shack. Caleb swore under his breath. 3 against 1, and he had maybe 5 bullets left. The younger outlaw made his move first, rushing the front of the shack with his gun raised. Caleb fired, and the man went down with a scream, clutching his leg. The other 2 opened fire, bullets tearing through the rotted wood, splinters exploding inward. Caleb ducked low, covering his head, feeling the impact of the shots vibrating through the walls. Eliza's cries rose to a shriek. Caleb couldn't stay here. They'd pin him down, surround him, and finish it. He needed to move. He grabbed Eliza, ignored her wailing, and bolted for the back of the shack where the wall had partially collapsed. He squeezed through the gap, emerged into the cold morning air, and ran. Behind him, he heard the outlaws shouting. More gunfire. A bullet clipped the rock beside his head, and Caleb threw himself down behind a boulder, breathing hard. This was bad. He was pinned, outgunned, and carrying a baby. And then he heard new voices, rough, authoritative, and coming from the direction of the ravine entrance. "Drop your weapons, now!" Caleb risked a look and saw 4 men on horseback descending into the ravine, badges glinting on their chests. Rail deputies, by the look of them. Frank must have sent word. The outlaws hesitated, caught between Caleb and the deputies. The scarred man's face twisted with rage. "This ain't over," he snarled in Caleb's direction. "Yes, it is," one of the deputies said, leveling a rifle at him. "Drop the guns or we drop you." For a long, tense moment, nobody moved. Then the scarred man let his rifle fall to the ground. The other 2 followed suit, hands raised. The deputies closed in, dismounting and securing the outlaws with practiced efficiency. One of them, A tall man with a graying mustache approached Caleb. "You Rourke?" Caleb nodded, still holding Eliza close. "Frank Hastings sent us, said you might need help." The deputy looked at the wailing baby, then back at Caleb. "Looks like he was right. Appreciate the timing," Caleb said roughly. The deputy grinned. "We aim to please. Come on, let's get you and the little one back to town before she freezes." They rode back to Bitter Hollow in a tight group, the outlaws bound and sullen, their horses tied in a line. The sun was fully up now, warming the air, melting the last of the snow from the rooftops. When they reached Doc Mercer's office, Caleb didn't wait for an invitation. He dismounted, handed his horse's reins to one of the deputies, and strode inside with Eliza still in his arms. Doc Mercer looked up from his desk, startled. "Mr. Rourke, I wasn't expecting—" "How is she?" Caleb demanded. "Stable. She made it through the night. I'd say that's a very good sign." Relief washed over Caleb so powerfully it left him dizzy. "Can I see her?" "She's sleeping, but yes, briefly." Caleb followed the doctor into the back room. Mara lay in a real bed now, propped up on pillows, her face still pale, but no longer death gray. Her breathing was even, her expression peaceful. Caleb stood at the foot of the bed, holding Eliza, and felt something inside him finally unclench. "She's going to make it," Doc Mercer said quietly. "It'll be a long recovery, but she's strong. Stronger than I expected." "Yeah," Caleb said. "She is." Eliza squirmed in his arms, letting out a small, whimpering cry. Mara stirred at the sound, her eyes fluttering open. "Caleb?" Her voice was weak but clear. "Right here," he said, moving to her side. She looked at Eliza, and her eyes filled with tears. "Is she—" "Fine. We're all fine." Mara reached out a trembling hand, and Caleb carefully placed Eliza into her arms. Mara held the baby close, tears streaming down her face, her whole body shaking with silent sobs. "I thought I'd lost you both," she whispered. "You didn't," Caleb said firmly. "You're both here, and you're safe." Mara looked up at him, her eyes searching his face. "The men who— taken care of. They won't bother you again." She let out a shaky breath. "I don't know how to thank you." "You don't have to." "Yes, I do." Her voice was fierce despite its weakness. "You saved my life. You saved my daughter's life. That's not something I can just—" "Mara," Caleb's voice was gentle but firm. "You don't owe me anything. You just focus on getting better." She held his gaze for a long moment, then nodded. "All right, but when I'm better, we're going to talk about this." "Sure," Caleb said, though he had no intention of being around long enough for that conversation. Doc Mercer cleared his throat. "I hate to interrupt, but Mrs. Whitlock needs rest, and the baby needs feeding. Mrs. Calloway's offered to help with Eliza until Mara's strong enough to nurse again." Caleb nodded and carefully took Eliza from Mara's arms. The baby fussed, reaching back toward her mother, and Mara's face crumpled. "I'm sorry," she whispered to Eliza. "I'm so sorry, baby. Mama needs to get strong for you." "She will," Caleb said. "You both will." He left the room before Mara could see the doubt in his eyes. Outside, he found Mrs. Calloway waiting, her face anxious. "Is she all right? The poor dear—" "She's alive," Caleb said. "That's what matters." Mrs. Calloway nodded and took Eliza from him with practiced ease. "I'll take care of this little one. You look like you could use some rest yourself, Mr. Rourke." "I'm fine." "You're half dead on your feet. Come back to the boarding house. I've got a hot meal waiting and a bed with your name on it." Caleb wanted to refuse, but his body had other ideas. The adrenaline was fading, leaving exhaustion in its wake. He nodded and followed Mrs. Calloway back through the streets of Bitter Hollow. The town was coming alive now, miners heading to work, shopkeepers opening their doors, children playing in the muddy streets. It was ordinary, safe, the kind of place a man could disappear into and forget the world existed beyond its borders. But Caleb wasn't that kind of man. At the boarding house, Mrs. Calloway fed him stew and fresh bread, then shooed him upstairs. Caleb collapsed onto the bed and was asleep before his head hit the pillow. He dreamed of the war, of mud and blood and screaming, of faces he'd tried to forget and names he couldn't remember. He woke with a start, his heart pounding, and found the room dark. Night had fallen. He sat up, disoriented, and heard soft cooing from across the room. Eliza lay in her makeshift cradle, wide awake, staring at the ceiling. Caleb got up and looked down at her. "Can't sleep either, huh?" She turned her head at the sound of his voice and made a small, gurgling sound. "Yeah, I know the feeling." He picked her up, more out of instinct than any real plan, and sat in the chair by the window. Eliza settled against his chest, her tiny hand gripping his shirt. Outside, Bitter Hollow was quiet. Lamplight glowed in a few windows. Somewhere, a dog barked. The stars were out, bright and cold, stretching across the sky like scattered diamonds. Caleb looked down at Eliza and felt the weight of the promise he'd made. He'd told Mara he'd take care of her daughter. But what did that mean? He was a drifter, a man with no home, no future, no ties to anywhere or anyone. How could he take care of a baby when he could barely take care of himself? A knock at the door startled him. He stood, still holding Eliza, and opened it to find Frank Hastings standing in the hallway, hat in hand. "Evening, Caleb. Mind if I come in?" "Depends. You here to arrest me?" Frank chuckled. "No, just wanted to check on you. Heard you had a rough morning." Caleb stepped aside and Frank entered, glancing around the small room. "Deputies told me what happened," Frank said. "Those men are locked up in the town jail. They'll be transferred to Cheyenne in a few days to stand trial." "Good. They also told me you handled yourself pretty well out there." Caleb shrugged. "I did what I had to." Frank nodded slowly. "That seems to be your way." They stood in silence for a moment. Eliza yawned and Frank smiled. "She's a pretty little thing. Got her mama's nose." "Maybe." Frank's expression turned serious. "What are you planning to do, Caleb?" "What do you mean?" "I mean, what happens next? Mara's going to recover, but it'll be weeks before she's strong enough to travel. And even then, she's got no money, no wagon, no husband. She's going to need help." "That's not my problem," Caleb said, but the words felt hollow even as he spoke them. "Isn't it?" Frank's eyes were sharp. "You made it your problem when you stayed with her that first night, when you delivered her baby, when you dragged her through a blizzard to save her life." "I did what anyone would have done." "No, Caleb. You did what most men wouldn't, and that matters." Caleb turned away, staring out the window. "I'm not a hero, Frank. I'm just a man who was in the wrong place at the wrong time." "Maybe. Or maybe you were in the right place at the right time." Frank stepped closer. "This town could use a man like you. We've got work, plenty of it. The rail line's expanding, the mines are booming. You could settle here. Make something of yourself." "I don't settle." "Why not?" Caleb didn't answer. He didn't know how to explain the restlessness that drove him, the ghosts that followed him, the emptiness that had become so familiar it felt like home. Frank sighed. "All right, I won't push, but think about it, Caleb. You've got a chance here. A real chance. Don't throw it away." He left, closing the door softly behind him. Caleb looked down at Eliza, who had fallen asleep against his chest, her breathing soft and steady. A chance. He'd stopped believing in those a long time ago. But maybe, just maybe, Frank was right. The days that followed fell into a rhythm Caleb hadn't expected, hadn't planned for, hadn't wanted, but found himself settling into all the same. Mornings began with Eliza's cries, thin and insistent, pulling him from restless sleep. He'd learned to warm the goat's milk just right, to hold the bottle at the correct angle, to support her head with his calloused palm. Mrs. Calloway watched him sometimes from the doorway, a knowing smile on her face, but she said nothing, just brought him coffee and left him to it. After feeding Eliza, he'd walk her to Doc Mercer's office, where Mara was slowly, agonizingly slowly, regaining her strength. The first few visits, she'd been too weak to do more than hold the baby and cry. But by the 4th day, she was sitting up. By the 7th, she was walking, just to the window and back, leaning heavily on the doctor's arm, but walking. Caleb would stay for an hour, sometimes 2, watching Mara hold Eliza, listening to her whisper promises and apologies and prayers into the baby's downy hair. Then he'd take Eliza back to Mrs. Calloway and disappear. He'd tried leaving on the 3rd day, packed his saddlebag, settled his bill with Mrs. Calloway, saddled his horse. But when he'd gone to say goodbye to Mara, she'd looked at him with those exhausted, desperate eyes and asked him to stay just one more day. just until she was strong enough to manage on her own. One more day had turned into 2, then 3, then a week. And somewhere in that time, Caleb stopped counting. He picked up work where he could find it, hauling supplies for the general store, repairing fences for a rancher on the outskirts of town, helping to clear debris from a collapsed mine shaft. The work was hard and the pay was modest, but it kept him busy, kept his mind from wandering to places he didn't want it to go. Frank Hastings appeared at the boarding house one evening near the end of the second week, carrying a bottle of whiskey and wearing a grin. "Heard you've been making yourself useful around town," Frank said, settling into the chair across from Caleb at the kitchen table. "Needed the money," Caleb said. "Sure you did." Frank poured 2 glasses and slid one across to Caleb. "Word is you helped old man Patterson fix his barn roof yesterday. Didn't charge him a dime. Roof was going to collapse, would have killed his livestock. And you helped Mrs. Chen carry her groceries home 3 days in a row. She's 80 years old and walks with a cane." Frank chuckled. "You keep telling yourself you're just passing through, Caleb. Maybe one day you'll believe it." Caleb drank his whiskey and didn't reply. Frank leaned back in his chair, studying him. "Mara's doing better. Doc says she'll be able to leave his care in another week or so. After that, she'll need a place to stay. Somewhere she can recover fully and figure out what comes next." "Mrs. Calloway's already offered her a room here," Caleb said. "She told me yesterday." "That's good. That's real good." Frank paused. "But she's still going to need help, Caleb. She's got no money, no family, no way to provide for herself and that baby." "What are you getting at?" "I'm getting at the fact that there's a job opening at the rail depot, paying position. Clerk work mostly, tracking shipments, managing inventory. Nothing glamorous, but it's steady, and it comes with a small house on company land." Caleb set his glass down. "You offering me a job?" "I'm offering you an option. Take it or leave it. But if you take it, you'd be doing more than helping yourself. You'd be helping Mara, giving her and Eliza some stability while they get their feet under them." "And then what? I play nursemaid indefinitely?" Frank's expression turned serious. "No. You do what you think is right. But I've seen the way you look at that baby, Caleb. And I've seen the way Mara looks at you. You've built something here, whether you meant to or not. Question is, are you brave enough to see where it goes?" Caleb stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "I'm not brave. I'm a coward who's been running for 5 years." "Running from what?" Caleb didn't answer. He grabbed the bottle, refilled his glass, and drained it in one swallow. Frank rose, clapped a hand on Caleb's shoulder, and left without another word. That night, Caleb couldn't sleep. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to Eliza's soft breathing from the cradle. His mind churned with memories he'd tried to bury. The war, the faces of men he'd killed, the friends he'd lost, the emptiness that had swallowed him when he came home and found nothing waiting. He'd thought that by staying in motion, by never putting down roots, he could outrun the weight of it all. But the weight had followed him. It was there in every town he passed through, every job he worked, every sunset he watched alone. And now, for the first time in years, he wasn't alone. Eliza stirred, whimpering, and Caleb got up. He lifted her from the cradle and held her against his chest, rocking her gently until she settled. "What am I supposed to do with you, kid?" he whispered. Eliza yawned and curled her tiny fingers around his thumb. Caleb closed his eyes and let himself imagine, just for a moment, what it might be like to stay. To take the job Frank offered. To help Mara rebuild her life. To watch Eliza grow up in a place that was safe and warm and full of possibility. It was a dangerous thing to imagine. But he couldn't seem to stop. 2 days later, Mara was discharged from Doc Mercer's care. Mrs. Calloway had prepared a room for her on the first floor of the boarding house. Small, but clean, with a window that overlooked the garden and a crib that one of the miners had built and donated. Caleb helped Mara up the front steps, his hand steadying her elbow as she moved slowly, carefully, still weak, but determined. Inside, Mrs. Calloway fussed over her like a mother hen, settling her into a chair by the fire and wrapping a quilt around her shoulders. Eliza was asleep in the crib, oblivious to the commotion. Mara looked around the room, her eyes bright with tears. "It's perfect," she said softly. "I don't know how to thank you, Mrs. Calloway." "No thanks needed, dear. You just focus on getting your strength back." Mrs. Calloway excused herself to make tea, leaving Caleb and Mara alone. Mara looked up at him, her expression unreadable. "You're still here." "Yeah." "Why?" Caleb shrugged. "Unfinished business." "That's not an answer." "It's the only one I've got." Mara smiled faintly. "You're a terrible liar, Caleb Rourke." He didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing. Mara's smile faded, and she looked down at her hands. "I meant what I said before. I owe you my life. Eliza owes you her life. That's not a debt I can ever repay." "I don't want repayment." "Then what do you want?" The question caught him off guard. What did he want? For the first time in years, he didn't have an answer. "I don't know," he admitted. Mara studied him for a long moment, then reached out and took his hand. Her grip was weak but steady. "Stay," she said quietly. "Please. Just a little longer. Until I figure out what comes next." Caleb looked at her hand in his, felt the warmth of her skin, the fragility and strength of her all at once. "All right," he said. "A little longer." The days stretched into weeks, and winter gave way to early spring. The snow melted, revealing brown grass and muddy streets. The air warmed, and the town began to stir with new energy. Miners working longer hours, merchants restocking their shelves, families emerging from their homes to enjoy the sun. Caleb took the job at the rail depot. It was dull work, just as Frank had promised, but it was honest and it paid. He moved into the small company house, a single-room structure with a stove, a bed, and a table, and began to build something resembling a routine. He still visited Mara and Eliza every day, watched as Mara regained her strength, her color returning, her movements becoming surer. Watched as Eliza grew, her eyes brightening, her cries becoming less frequent and more expressive. One evening in late March, Mara invited him to stay for dinner. Mrs. Calloway had taught her how to make a simple stew, and Mara was eager to try her hand at cooking again. They ate together at the small table in her room, Eliza sleeping peacefully in her crib nearby. The stew was decent, better than anything Caleb could have made, and the conversation was easy, comfortable. "I've been thinking," Mara said, setting down her spoon, "about what comes next." Caleb looked up. "Yeah?" Mrs. Calloway offered me a job helping her run the boarding house, cleaning, cooking, managing guests. It wouldn't pay much, but it would be enough. Enough for me and Eliza to get by. "That's good," Caleb said. "That's real good." "It is," Mara agreed. She hesitated, then added, "But I keep thinking about what you said that first night, about how you were just someone who was there." "I remember. I don't think that's true anymore." Her voice was soft but firm. "You're not just someone who was there, Caleb. You're someone who stayed, and that means something." Caleb set down his own spoon, his chest tightening. "Mara, I'm not asking you for anything," she said quickly. "I just want you to know that whatever you decide to do, wherever you decide to go, you've already given me and Eliza more than we could ever ask for. You've given us a chance, and I'll always be grateful for that." Caleb didn't know what to say. He looked at Mara, really looked at her, and saw not the desperate dying woman he'd found in the snow, but someone strong, capable, and alive. Someone who'd fought through hell and come out the other side. "You did that yourself," he said finally. "I just kept you breathing long enough for you to do it." Mara smiled, and it was the first real smile he'd seen from her. "Maybe, but I wouldn't have made it without you." They finished their meal in silence, and when Caleb left, he felt something shift inside him, a loosening of the knot he'd carried for so long, a quiet sense of peace he didn't quite know what to do with. Spring deepened, and Bitter Hollow came fully alive. The trees budded, flowers bloomed in window boxes, and the streets filled with the sounds of children playing and merchants hawking their wares. Caleb settled into his life at the depot, surprising himself with how much he didn't hate it. The work was monotonous, yes, but it was also grounding. It gave him structure, purpose, something to focus on besides the ghosts in his head. He spent his evenings with Mara and Eliza, helping where he could, fixing a broken chair, chopping wood for the stove, making Eliza laugh by pulling faces. Mara had started working for Mrs. Calloway, and the two women had formed a partnership that seemed to benefit them both. One evening in mid-April, as Caleb was preparing to leave, Mara stopped him at the door. "Caleb, can we talk?" He turned, suddenly wary. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong." She gestured to the chairs by the window. "Sit, please." He sat, and Mara took the chair across from him. Eliza was awake, lying on a blanket on the floor, gurgling and kicking her legs. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," Mara began, "about the future, about what I want for Eliza, what kind of life I want to build for her." "That's good," Caleb said carefully. "And I realized something." She met his eyes. "I realized that I don't want to do it alone." Caleb's heart began to pound. "Mara, let me finish." Her voice was steady, determined. "I'm not asking you to marry me or make some grand commitment. I know you're not ready for that. Maybe you never will be. But I'm asking you to consider staying, not just for a little longer, but for good. Be a part of Eliza's life. Be a part of my life. As a friend, as family, as whatever feels right." Caleb stared at her, his mind racing. A part of him wanted to run, to saddle his horse and ride out of Bitter Hollow and never look back. But a larger part, a part he'd tried to ignore for weeks, wanted to stay. "I'm not good at this," he said finally. "At staying, at being what people need." "Neither am I," Mara said. "But we can figure it out together." Caleb looked down at Eliza, who had grabbed her own foot and was trying to fit it into her mouth. She looked up at him and smiled, a big, toothless, joyful smile that hit him like a punch to the gut. "She needs someone stable," he said. "Someone who knows what they're doing." "She needs someone who loves her," Mara corrected. "And you do. I've seen it." Caleb opened his mouth to argue, then closed it. Because she was right. Somewhere along the way, without meaning to, without even realizing it, he'd fallen in love with this tiny, helpless, impossibly resilient human being. And maybe, just maybe, he'd fallen a little bit in love with the idea of having something to fight for that wasn't just survival. "All right," he said quietly. Mara's eyes widened. "All right. I'll stay. Not forever, maybe, but for as long as it makes sense. For as long as you and Eliza need me." Mara's face crumpled, and she started to cry. Not sad tears, but tears of relief and joy. She reached across the space between them and took his hand. "Thank you," she whispered. Caleb squeezed her hand and nodded, not trusting himself to speak. The months that followed were the most ordinary of Caleb's life, and the most extraordinary. He worked at the depot, saved his money, and helped Mara and Mrs. Calloway renovate parts of the boarding house. He watched Eliza learn to crawl, then pull herself up, then take her first wobbly steps. He taught her to clap her hands and mimic animal sounds, and she rewarded him with laughter that felt like sunlight breaking through clouds. Mara thrived. She grew stronger, more confident, more herself. She and Caleb developed an easy partnership, not romantic, not yet, but something deeper and more enduring. They were partners in survival, in parenthood, in building something new from the wreckage of what they'd lost. The town accepted Caleb as one of their own. He stopped being the stranger who'd arrived with a dying woman and became just Caleb, the man who worked at the depot, who helped his neighbors, who could be counted on when things got hard. And slowly, gradually, the ghosts began to fade. They didn't disappear entirely. Caleb knew they never would, but they lost their power over him. The nightmares came less frequently. The restlessness that had driven him for so long quieted to a whisper. He'd found something he hadn't known he was looking for. Not redemption, exactly. Not absolution. But something close. Something that felt like home. One evening in late summer, as the sun set over Bitter Hollow in shades of gold and crimson, Caleb sat on the porch of the boarding house with Eliza on his knee. She was almost a year old now, chattering in her nonsensical baby language, pointing at birds and clouds and anything else that caught her attention. Mara stepped out onto the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. "She'll be needing her supper soon." "Just a few more minutes," Caleb said. Mara smiled and sat down beside him. They watched the sun sink below the horizon in comfortable silence. "Do you ever regret it?" Mara asked suddenly. "Staying?" Caleb thought about the question. Thought about the life he'd left behind, the endless drifting, the isolation, the emptiness. Thought about the life he had now, the work, the noise, the connections, the responsibility. No, he said. I don't. Mara rested her head on his shoulder. Good, because I don't think I could have done any of this without you. You're stronger than you think. Maybe. But I'm glad I didn't have to find out. Eliza squirmed in Caleb's arms and pointed at the sky. Bah! She said excitedly. Bah, bah! That's right, kid, Caleb said, smiling. Bird. He felt Mara's hand slip into his, and he squeezed it gently. For the first time in as long as he could remember, Caleb Rourke felt at peace. The frontier had taken so much from him, his innocence, his hope, his faith in the world, but it had also given him something unexpected, something worth fighting for, a family, a home, a future. And as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Caleb held Eliza close and let himself believe that maybe, just maybe, he deserved it. The wind blew soft and warm across the Wyoming plains, carrying with it the promise of tomorrow. And for the first time, Caleb wasn't afraid to face it. When she saw Caleb, relief flooded her face. You're all right, she said. Yeah. The men who attacked us? Won't be attacking anyone else. She nodded slowly, understanding what he wasn't saying. I'm glad you're safe. Caleb sat down heavily. Don't know how much longer you'll be here. Doctor says another week, maybe 2, then you can travel. Travel where? South Fork, your husband's brother. That's where you were headed, right? Lydia looked down at Eliza. Samuel's brother. We never met. Samuel said he was a good man, but... She trailed off. But what? But I don't know him. Don't know if he'll even want us. A widow and a baby. Her voice was small. Don't know if anywhere is home anymore. Caleb understood that feeling. He'd been homeless for 7 years, drifting from town to town, never staying long enough to put down roots. You'll figure it out, he said. Will you stay? Until I'm well enough to travel? The question caught him off guard. I don't know. Please, she met his eyes. I know I have no right to ask, but I'd feel safer if you were here. Caleb thought about the open road, the endless horizon, the freedom that came with having nothing to lose. He'd been running for so long it had become the only thing he knew how to do. But he looked at Lydia and Eliza, at the fragile life he'd helped bring into the world, and something in him hesitated. All right, he heard himself say. I'll stay. The relief in Lydia's face was palpable. Thank you. Over the next 2 weeks, Caleb fell into an unfamiliar routine. He helped Mrs. Chen with repairs around the boarding house, fixing loose boards, patching the roof, chopping wood. He visited Lydia and Eliza every day, watching the baby grow stronger, watching Lydia's health return. Coopersville was a good town, small enough that everyone knew everyone, but big enough to have everything you needed. The people were friendly but respectful of privacy. Nobody asked too many questions about where Caleb had come from or why he was staying. He found work at the livery stable, mucking stalls and tending horses. The pay wasn't much, but it kept him busy, and busy was good. Busy meant less time to think, but the nights were harder. In the dark, lying in his too-soft bed, the memories came. Emma's face, the stillborn baby, the cabin burning, 7 years of wandering, of saloons and camps, of men who'd tried to kill him and men he'd killed first. What was he doing here? He wasn't a family man, wasn't the kind who settled down. He was a drifter, a gun hand, someone who moved through the world leaving nothing behind. Yet every morning, he found himself walking to Dr. Hartwell's house. One afternoon, he arrived to find Lydia dressed and out of bed, sitting in a chair by the window with Eliza in her arms. Doctor says I can leave tomorrow, she said, if I take it slow. That's good news, is it? She looked out the window at the snow-covered street. I've been thinking about South Fork, about Samuel's brother. And I don't think I can go there. She turned to face him. I don't think I can walk into a stranger's house and ask for charity, not for myself and not for Eliza. What will you do? I don't know. Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled slightly. I have a little money. Samuel saved some. Not much, but enough to last a few months if I'm careful. You could stay here, Caleb said.
Coopersville's a decent town. Doing what? I'm not a teacher, not a seamstress. I can cook, I can clean, but she looked down at Eliza. I have a baby to care for. Mrs. Chen might need help at the boarding house. Lydia's eyes brightened slightly. You think she'd hire me? Only one way to find out. That evening, Caleb spoke to Mrs. Chen. The older woman listened carefully, her sharp eyes missing nothing. The widow with baby? She said. She can cook? She says so. American food or good food? Despite everything, Caleb smiled. You'd have to ask her. Mrs. Chen considered this. I am getting old. Stairs are hard, back hurts. Help would be good. She looked at Caleb. You vouch for her? With my life. Then she can stay. Room and board plus small wage. We see if she can cook. When Caleb told Lydia, she cried, great, heaving sobs of relief. He stood awkwardly, not sure what to do, until she reached out and pulled him into a fierce hug. Thank you, she whispered. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Eliza, caught between them, made a sound of protest. They both laughed, pulling apart. She's getting her opinion in early, Lydia said, wiping her eyes. Smart kid. The next day, Lydia and Eliza moved into Mrs. Chen's boarding house. She took a small room on the first floor, easier with the baby, and started work immediately. Within days, it was clear she could more than cook. Her stews were rich and flavorful, her bread perfectly golden, her pies the kind that made grown men weep. She cooks good food, Mrs. Chen admitted to Caleb. American food, but good anyway. Life settled into something resembling normalcy. Caleb worked at the livery. Lydia cooked and cared for Eliza. They saw each other at meals, exchanged pleasantries, kept things polite and distant. But something was building between them, something neither of them acknowledged. One evening, nearly a month after they'd arrived, Caleb was sitting on the boarding house porch, smoking a cigarette and watching the sun set. Lydia came out, wrapped in a shawl, and sat beside him. Eliza's asleep, she said. Finally, she fought it for an hour. Stubborn already. Gets it from her mother, Lydia smiled. Caleb, can I ask you something? Sure. Why did you really help us? That night in the snow? You could have ridden past. Pretended you didn't hear. Why didn't you? Caleb was quiet for a long time. The cigarette burned down between his fingers. I heard my wife's voice, he said finally. And that scream. Heard her calling for help, and He stopped, swallowed. I couldn't save her, but maybe I could save you. Lydia's hand found his, squeezed gently. You did, she said. You saved us both. They sat in silence as the last light faded from the sky. Somewhere in town, a piano played. Dogs barked. The wind carried the smell of wood smoke and snow. I was going to leave, Caleb said. After you were well. I was going to ride out and not look back. And now? Now, I don't know. You could stay, Lydia said softly. If you wanted to. I'm not the staying kind. Maybe you were never given a reason to stay. Caleb looked at her, really looked at her. She was beautiful in a quiet way, with tired eyes that had seen too much but still held hope. She'd lost a husband, nearly died giving birth, survived things that would have broken most people. And she was offering him something he'd thought he'd never have again. A chance, a possibility, a reason to stop running. I don't know how to do this, he admitted. Don't know how to be this. Neither do I, Lydia said. But maybe we figure it out together. Inside, Eliza started crying. Lydia stood, touching Caleb's shoulder as she passed. Think about it, she said. He did. For 3 days, he thought about nothing else. On the 4th day, he made his decision. He found Lydia in the kitchen, kneading bread dough with practiced hands. Eliza was in a basket nearby, watching her mother with solemn eyes. I'm staying, Caleb said. Lydia's hands stilled. She turned to look at him, flour dusting her cheeks. You're sure? No, he said honestly. But I'm doing it anyway. She smiled, bright and genuine and full of something that might have been joy. Then I guess we're in this together. Guess so. He started to leave, but she called him back. Caleb? Yeah? Thank you for taking a chance. Could say the same to you. That night, Caleb lay in bed and realized something had changed. The restlessness that had driven him for 7 years was still there, but it was quieter now, manageable. He thought about Emma, about the life he'd lost. He couldn't bring it back, couldn't undo the past. But maybe, just maybe, he could build something new. The next morning, he woke to find fresh snow had fallen overnight, covering Coopersville in a blanket of white. The sun was bright, the air crisp and clean. Caleb dressed and went downstairs. In the kitchen, Lydia was making breakfast while Eliza gurgled in her basket. The smell of coffee and bacon filled the air. It wasn't the life he'd planned, but it was the life he had. And for the first time in 7 years, that was enough. Spring arrived slowly that year, fighting winter for every inch of ground. The snow receded in patches, revealing brown earth and the first brave shoots of green. The river behind the boarding house thawed with a sound like breaking glass, water rushing free after months of silence. Caleb stood at the window of his room, watching the transformation. 2 months had passed since that first breakfast with Lydia and Eliza. 2 months of ordinary days that felt extraordinary simply because they were his. He'd fallen into a rhythm, work at the livery during the day, meals at Mrs. Chen's table, evenings spent helping Lydia with Eliza, or just sitting in companionable silence. It was the kind of life he'd stopped believing in. A knock interrupted his thoughts. When he opened the door, he found Tommy Chen bouncing on his heels with barely contained excitement. "Mr. Rourke, there's a man downstairs asking for you, says his name is Marcus Hale." The name meant nothing to Caleb, but something in the boy's tone made his instincts prickle. "What does he want?" "Didn't say, but he looks important. Got a fancy coat and everything." Caleb followed Tommy downstairs, his hand instinctively checking for the revolver he no longer wore during the day. Old habits. The man waiting in the boarding house parlor was tall and broad-shouldered, maybe 40 years old, with the kind of weathered face that came from years of outdoor work. His clothes were well-made but practical, not a dandy but someone with money. He turned when Caleb entered, his eyes sharp and assessing. "Caleb Rourke?" the man asked. "That's right." "Marcus Hale." The man extended his hand. "Samuel Hale was my brother." Caleb's stomach dropped. He shook the offered hand, his mind racing. "I'm sorry for your loss." "Thank you." Marcus's expression was unreadable. "I understand my sister-in-law and niece are staying here. I'd like to see them." "Lydia's at the market with Eliza. Should be back soon." "Then I'll wait." Marcus settled into a chair, his gaze never leaving Caleb's face. "You're the one who saved them, I hear, out in the snow." "I helped. A lot of people helped." "Don't be modest. Sheriff Brennan wrote me a letter, told me what happened. Said you delivered the baby yourself. Kept Lydia alive when she should have died, fought off bandits." Marcus leaned forward slightly. "That's more than helping. That's heroic." Caleb shifted uncomfortably. "Just did what needed doing." "And then you stayed. Why?" The question hung in the air between them, sharp and challenging. Caleb met Marcus's eyes steadily. "Because they needed someone. And He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I couldn't walk away." "Couldn't or didn't want to? Does it matter?" Marcus smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "I suppose not. What matters is that you're here now and Lydia and my niece are safe. For that, you have my gratitude." "Didn't do it for gratitude." "No, I don't imagine you did." Marcus stood, walked to the window. "I came to Coopersville to bring them home, to South Fork. The ranch is doing well. We have room, resources, family. It's where Samuel would have wanted them." Caleb felt something cold settle in his chest. "Have you asked Lydia what she wants?" "Not yet, but surely she'll see reason. A widow with a child, no husband, no means of support. She needs family. She has a job here, a place to live, people who care about her." Marcus turned, his expression hardening. "She has charity. There's a difference." He paused, then added more gently, "Look, I'm not questioning what you've done for her, but I'm her family, blood family, and I can give her and Eliza a real home, a real future. Can you say the same?" Before Caleb could answer, the door opened and Lydia entered, Eliza on her hip and a basket over her arm. She stopped short when she saw Marcus, her face going pale. "Marcus," she breathed. "Lydia." He crossed the room quickly, embracing her carefully so as not to crush the baby between them.
I'm so sorry about Samuel, about everything. She pulled back, tears streaming down her face. I wrote you after he died. Did you get the letter? I did. I would have come sooner, but the passes were snowed in until last week. He looked at Eliza, his expression softening. This is her? This is Eliza Grace? Yes. Lydia shifted the baby so Marcus could see her better. Eliza regarded him with solemn dark eyes, one finger in her mouth. She has Samuel's eyes, Marcus said quietly. The same expression he'd get when he was thinking hard about something. He looked back at Lydia. She's beautiful. You did well. I had help. Lydia's eyes found Caleb's across the room. A lot of help. Marcus followed her gaze, and something flickered in his expression, understanding maybe, or concern. So, I've been told. Mr. Rourke and I were just discussing that. An awkward silence fell. Mrs. Chen appeared in the doorway, took in the scene with her sharp eyes, and clapped her hands once. Too much standing and talking, she announced. Come, sit. I bring tea and food. You talk properly. Nobody argued with Mrs. Chen. They gathered around the dining table. Caleb, Lydia, Marcus, and Eliza, who sat in a high chair Caleb had built and smeared mashed carrots across her face with evident delight. Mrs. Chen brought tea and small cakes, then disappeared with a meaningful look that suggested they should work things out themselves. I want you to come to South Fork, Marcus said without preamble, addressing Lydia. Both of you. The ranch is yours as much as it would have been Samuel's. Your family. Lydia set down her teacup carefully. Marcus, that's very generous, but it's not generosity. It's family obligation. And more than that, it's what Samuel would have wanted. He leaned forward, his voice earnest. Lydia, I know this past year has been hell for you. Losing Samuel, the baby coming early, nearly dying yourself. But you don't have to struggle anymore. Come home. Let us take care of you. I'm not struggling, Lydia said quietly. I have a job here, a home. Working in a boarding house kitchen? Marcus's tone was gentle but pointed. That's no life for my brother's widow. You deserve better. I'm happy here. Are you? Truly? Marcus glanced at Caleb. Or are you just grateful to the people who helped you? Lydia's eyes flashed. Don't confuse gratitude with happiness. They're not the same thing. I know that. But I also know what it's like to be alone and scared and willing to accept whatever stability you can find. He reached across the table, took her hand. I'm offering you something real, Lydia. Security. Family. A future for Eliza where she'll never want for anything. Lydia pulled her hand back gently. What if what she needs isn't things? What if she needs a place where people know her name, where she's part of a community? South Fork is a community. It's your community, not mine. She looked at Eliza, who was now trying to grab at the teacups. This is hers. The people here delivered her, saved her, watched her take her first steps. They're her family too. Marcus sat back, frustration evident in the set of his shoulders. I'm not the enemy here, Lydia. I'm trying to help. I know you are, and I appreciate it, truly. Her voice softened. But I can't go with you. Not now. Maybe not ever. The silence that followed was heavy. Caleb sat frozen, afraid that any movement would shatter whatever fragile equilibrium they'd reached. Eliza chose that moment to knock over her cup of water, the crash breaking the tension. I'll get a cloth, Caleb said, grateful for the excuse to move. When he returned, Marcus was standing, preparing to leave. I'm staying at the hotel, he said to Lydia. I'll be in town for a few days. If you change your mind, I won't. Marcus looked at her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. All right, but the offer stands, always. He turned to Caleb. Take care of them. I will. After Marcus left, Lydia slumped in her chair, suddenly exhausted. Eliza, sensing her mother's distress, started to fuss. Caleb lifted the baby out of the high chair, bouncing her gently. You okay? He asked Lydia. I don't know. She rubbed her face. He's right about some things. South Fork would be easier, safer. Eliza would have opportunities there she might never have here. But it's not home. She looked up at him. Does that make sense? A place I've never been, with people I barely know, isn't home. This is. And I don't want to leave. Caleb felt something loosen in his chest.
something he hadn't realized had been clenched tight. Then don't. It's not that simple. Marcus came all this way. He's offering us everything. How do I just say no? You already did. He shifted Eliza to his other arm. You told him the truth. That's all you can do. What if I'm making a mistake? What if I'm being selfish, keeping Eliza here when she could have more somewhere else? Or what if you're being brave, choosing what's right for both of you instead of what's easy? He handed Eliza back to her. You're her mother. You know what she needs. Lydia held her daughter close, breathing in her baby smell. I'm scared, Caleb. What if I can't give her enough? What if... Stop. He crouched beside her chair, his voice firm but gentle.
You're giving her something money can't buy. Roots, belonging, love. That's enough. That's more than enough. She looked at him, and in her eyes he saw the same fear he felt every day. The terror of not being enough, of failing the people who depended on you. But he also saw strength and determination, and a fierce protectiveness that reminded him why he'd fought so hard to keep her and Eliza alive. Thank you, she whispered. For what? For reminding me why I'm staying. Over the next few days, Marcus's presence hung over Coopersville like a storm cloud. He spent his time talking to people in town, asking questions about Lydia, about Caleb, about Eliza's life here. Caleb heard the reports secondhand. Marcus at the general store. Marcus talking to Sheriff Brennan. Marcus having dinner with Dr. Hartwell. He was building a case, Caleb realized, gathering information to either support or undermine Lydia's decision. On the third day, Marcus appeared at the livery where Caleb was working. Can we talk? Marcus asked. Caleb set down the harness he'd been mending. Sure. They walked outside, stood in the weak spring sunshine. The air smelled of mud and horse manure and growing things. I've been asking around, Marcus said. About you. I figured. People speak highly of you, say you're reliable, honest, hardworking. Marcus paused. They also say you've grown close to Lydia and Eliza. Caleb met his eyes steadily. That a problem? That depends on your intentions. My intentions? Don't play stupid. Marcus's voice hardened. You're a single man living in the same boarding house as a young widow. You spend time with her, help her with the baby, built furniture for her room. People talk. Let them. It's not that simple. Lydia's reputation is fine, Caleb interrupted. Mrs. Chen runs a respectable house. Everyone in town knows that. And everyone knows I've been nothing but appropriate. Maybe so. But what happens 6 months from now? A year? Marcus stepped closer. Look, I'm not blind. I can see there's something between you two. But Lydia's vulnerable right now. She's been through hell, and you were there to help her. That doesn't mean what? Caleb's own voice was cold now. Doesn't mean she could actually care about me, or doesn't mean I could care about her without some ulterior motive. I didn't say that. You didn't have to. Caleb took a breath, forced himself to calm down. I know what you think, that I'm taking advantage, that I'm trying to swoop in while she's weak, but you're wrong. Then what are you doing? I'm trying to be her friend, to help when she needs it and step back when she doesn't. That's all. Marcus studied him for a long moment. You love her. It wasn't a question. Caleb felt the truth of it settle over him like a physical weight. Yeah, he admitted quietly. I do, but that doesn't change anything. She's not ready for that. Maybe she never will be. And if that's the case, I'll live with it. And if she is ready, what then? You marry her, play father to my brother's daughter, build a life here? If she'll have me, yes. You don't even know if you can stay. You've been here, 3 months? What happens when the restlessness hits? When you get the urge to move on? I won't. You don't know that. You're right, Caleb said. I don't know that. I can't promise I won't wake up one day and feel the pull of the road, but I can promise that I'll fight it, that I'll choose her and Eliza and this life every single day. That's the best I can offer. Marcus was silent for a long time. Finally, he sighed. Samuel would have liked you, he said. He always respected honesty, even when it wasn't what he wanted to hear. I'm sorry I never got to meet him. So am I. Marcus extended his hand. Take care of them, Rourke. And if you ever hurt either of them, I'll hunt you down myself. Caleb shook his hand. Fair enough. That evening, Marcus came to dinner at Mrs. Chen's invitation. The meal was elaborate, dumplings and roasted duck, vegetables and sauces Caleb couldn't identify, but tasted incredible. Marcus entertained them with stories of South Fork, of the ranch, of Samuel as a boy. He was fearless, Marcus said, laughing at a memory. Rode his first wild horse when he was 12. Got thrown 7 times before he managed to stay on. Our father said he was too stubborn to quit. Lydia smiled, though her eyes were sad. He told me about that. Said it taught him that anything worth doing was worth getting thrown for. That sounds like him. Marcus looked at Eliza, who was drowsing in Lydia's arms. I wish he could have met her. So do I. The meal ended on a melancholy note. As people dispersed, Marcus pulled Lydia aside for a private conversation. Caleb gave them space, taking Eliza upstairs to get her ready for bed. He was changing her diaper, a task he'd gotten surprisingly good at, when Lydia appeared in the doorway. Marcus is leaving in the morning, she said. He understands my decision. He's not happy about it, but he understands. That's good. He also said, she paused, came into the room. He said if things don't work out here, the offer stands, that we'll always have a place with him. How do you feel about that? Grateful. Relieved. She sat on the bed, watched Caleb finish dressing Eliza in her nightgown. And a little bit terrified that I'm making a huge mistake. Second thoughts? Third and fourth thoughts, but the answer's still the same. She held out her arms for the baby. We're staying. Caleb handed Eliza over, watched as Lydia settled the baby against her shoulder. The lamplight made them both glow, turned them into something almost holy. Can I ask you something? Lydia said after a moment. Anything. What Marcus said about you, about us, about people talking. Is that true? Caleb sat on the chair across from the bed. Some, probably. People always talk. Does it bother you? No? He met her eyes. Does it bother you? I don't know. Maybe it should, but mostly I just... She trailed off, then started again. Mostly I just don't care what people think. Is that wrong? I don't think so. Even if they think there's something between us? Caleb's heart hammered against his ribs. Is there? The question hung in the air between them, heavy with possibility. Eliza had fallen asleep, her small hand fisted in Lydia's hair. I don't know, Lydia said finally. Sometimes I think there might be. Other times I think I'm just confused, mixing up gratitude with something else. She looked at him. What do you think? I think, Caleb said carefully, that you've been through hell and back. That you lost your husband less than a year ago, almost died giving birth, and are still figuring out how to be a mother on your own. I think you need time. And after I've had time, then we'll see. She nodded slowly. That's very patient of you. I've got nowhere else to be. Lydia laughed softly. Neither do I. She stood, cradling Eliza. I should put her to bed. Need help? No, I've got it. She paused at the door. Caleb? Yeah? Thank you for being patient, for being here, for everything. You don't have to keep thanking me. I know, but I'm going to anyway. After she left, Caleb sat in the empty room, his mind churning. He told Marcus the truth. He loved Lydia, loved Eliza, wanted to build a life with them. But he'd also meant what he said to her. She needed time to heal, to figure out who she was as a widow and a mother, before she could figure out if there was room for anything else, even if waiting killed him. The next morning, Marcus left on the early stage. Caleb watched from the livery as Lydia and Eliza said goodbye, saw the way Marcus held his niece like she was made of glass, the way he embraced Lydia and whispered something in her ear that made her nod. Then he was gone, and Coopersville returned to its usual rhythm. But something had shifted. Caleb felt it in the way Lydia looked at him now, in the small touches that seemed to linger a fraction too long, in the comfortable silences that stretched between them like bridges. One warm April afternoon, they took Eliza to the meadow behind the church. Wildflowers were blooming, bright splashes of yellow and purple against the green grass. Eliza toddled between them, laughing as she tried to catch butterflies. She's getting so big, Lydia said, watching her daughter with a mixture of pride and sadness. Sometimes I can't believe she's the same tiny thing you delivered in the snow. Time moves fast. Too fast. She looked at him. Do you ever wish you could slow it down, just freeze a moment and live in it forever?
Which moment would you choose? She thought about it. This one, maybe, right here, Eliza laughing, the sun warm, everything peaceful. Not a bad choice. What about you? What moment would you freeze? Caleb watched Eliza chase a butterfly, her small legs pumping, her face bright with joy.
He thought about the night in the snow, about Lydia's hand in his as she pushed, about that first cry cutting through the darkness. The moment when I realized you were going to make it, he said, when the bleeding stopped and I knew you'd survive. That's the one. Lydia's hand found his, squeezed gently. I'm glad I did. Survive, I mean. So am I. They stood together in the meadow, hands clasped, watching Eliza play. And for the first time since Emma died, Caleb allowed himself to imagine a future that didn't involve running. A future with roots and permanence and love. It terrified him. But he didn't let go of Lydia's hand. That night, unable to sleep, Caleb sat on the boarding house porch and thought about choices. About the choice he'd made to stop when he heard Lydia's scream, the choice to stay when he could have left, the choice to open his heart when every instinct screamed at him to keep it locked down tight. Can't sleep either? Lydia's voice came from the doorway. He turned to find her wrapped in a shawl, her hair loose around her shoulders. She looked younger like this, softer. Too much thinking, he admitted. She sat beside him on the porch swing. About what? About how we got here. About what comes next. And what did you decide? That I'm tired of running from the past, tired of being afraid. He looked at her. I want to build something, here, with you and Eliza, if you'll let me. Lydia's eyes shimmered in the lamplight. Are you sure? Because once we start down this path, I'm sure. He took her hand. I've never been more sure of anything. She leaned her head against his shoulder, and they sat in comfortable silence, the porch swing creaking gently. Above them, stars scattered across the black sky like scattered diamonds. In the distance, a coyote called and was answered. Caleb? Lydia said after a while. Yeah? I think I might be falling in love with you. His breath caught. You think? I know. She lifted her head to look at him. I'm falling in love with you, and it scares me to death. Good, he said, because I'm already there, and it's terrifying. She laughed, and he kissed her, softly at first, then deeper, tasting salt from tears he didn't know she'd been crying. When they finally pulled apart, she was smiling. So what now? She asked. Now we take it one day at a time, build our life together, see what happens. That's very practical. I'm a practical man. No, you're not. You're a dreamer who pretends to be practical. She kissed him again. But I love you anyway. Inside the boarding house, Eliza started crying, her hungry cry, the one that meant she'd wake the whole building if not tended to quickly. Duty calls? Lydia said, standing. Need help? Always. They went inside together, into the warmth and light, into the life they were building one ordinary moment at a time. And for both of them, it was enough, more than enough. It was everything. Spring came late to Coopersville that year, arriving in fits and starts. A warm day followed by 3 cold ones, snowmelt running in the streets one morning and ice forming again by nightfall. But it came, inevitably, the way all things came to the frontier, whether you were ready or not. Caleb stood in the doorway of the small house he'd been building for the past 2 months, watching the last patches of snow disappear into dark earth. The house wasn't much. 2 rooms and a loft, rough-hewn timber and a stone chimney, but it was solid. He'd built it with his own hands, every nail driven with the knowledge that this was permanent. This was staying. You're staring again, Lydia said behind him. He turned to find her carrying Eliza, who'd grown considerably in the months since that night in the snow. The baby could hold her head up now, could smile and laugh and grab at things with her tiny fists. Just thinking, Caleb said. About? About how we got here. Lydia shifted Eliza to her other hip. Having second thoughts? No. He said it quickly, firmly. No second thoughts. She studied his face for a moment, then nodded. Good, because Mrs. Chen is making you a celebration dinner tonight. The whole town's invited. The whole town?
Well, everyone who matters. She smiled. They want to welcome you properly, as one of them. The thought made Caleb uncomfortable in a way he couldn't quite name. He'd never been one of anything, not since he'd left his family's farm at 15 and struck out on his own. He'd been a hired hand, a drifter, a gun for hire when times got desperate, but never part of a community, never someone who belonged. I don't need a celebration, he said. Maybe they do. Lydia came closer, Eliza reaching out to grab at Caleb's beard. He caught her tiny hand gently. You've done a lot for this town, Caleb, more than you realize. I work at the livery and built a house. That's not much. You helped Sheriff Brennan track down those horse thieves last month. You sat with Bill Henderson when his wife was sick. You taught Tommy Chen how to ride. She touched his arm. You're not invisible anymore. People see you. They care about you. Eliza made a demanding sound and Lydia laughed. All right, little one, time for your nap. She looked back at Caleb. Think about it. It would mean a lot to them, to me. She went inside, leaving Caleb alone with his thoughts. The truth was, he had been thinking about it. About all of it. About how seamlessly he'd woven himself into the fabric of Coopersville. How natural it had started to feel. He knew the names of everyone on the main street. Knew who was courting who had a sick cow, who needed help with their harvest. It terrified him, because the last time he'd let himself care about people, about a place, it had been ripped away so completely that the wound still hadn't healed. And now here he was, building another house, making another home, daring to hope that this time might be different. That evening, Mrs. Chen's boarding house dining room was packed. Tables had been pushed together, covered with more food than Caleb had seen in one place since before the war. There was roasted chicken and beef, fresh bread still steaming, pies of every variety, and a massive pot of Mrs. Chen's dumplings that people fought over politely. Sheriff Brennan stood and raised his glass. To Caleb Rourke, he said, his voice carrying over the crowd. A man who rode into a storm for a stranger and stayed to become a friend. Welcome home. Welcome home, the crowd echoed, glasses clinking. Caleb felt his throat tighten. He managed a nod, not trusting himself to speak. The meal was loud and chaotic, full of laughter and conversation that flowed like water. Caleb sat between Lydia and old Bill Henderson, fielding questions about the house, about his plans, about whether he'd considered running for town council. We could use a man like you, Bill said, his weathered face serious. Someone who knows how to handle trouble. I'm not a politician, Caleb said. Neither was I, until my wife volunteered me. Bill laughed. Now I've been on this council for 12 years. It's not so bad, mostly just arguing about where to put the new well. Across the table, Lydia was talking with Sarah Hartwell. The two of them bent over Eliza and discussing something with the intensity of generals planning a campaign. The baby was being passed around the table like a prize, each person getting a turn to hold her and make ridiculous faces. Tommy Chen, Mrs. Chen's grandson, appeared at Caleb's elbow. He was maybe 10 years old with his grandmother's sharp eyes and a perpetual smudge of dirt on one cheek. Mr. Rourke, is it true you killed 5 men in a gunfight? Tommy! Mrs. Chen's voice cracked like a whip from across the room. You do not ask such things. The boy ducked his head, but his eyes were still bright with curiosity. It's all right, Caleb said quietly. He looked at Tommy. I've killed men, yes, but it's not something to be proud of. Every time you take a life, you lose a piece of yourself. Remember that. Tommy's face grew serious. Yes, sir. Now get out of here before your grandmother decides we both need scolding. The boy grinned and darted away. Later, when the meal had wound down and people were starting to drift home, Lydia found Caleb on the porch. The night was cool but not cold, the air smelling of damp earth and growing things. You survived, she said, settling onto the bench beside him. Barely, but he was smiling. They like you. They like anyone who isn't actively causing trouble. No, Lydia said firmly. They like you. There's a difference. She was quiet for a moment, then added, I like you too. Caleb turned to look at her. In the lamplight spilling from the windows, her face was soft, her eyes warm. Lydia, I know, she interrupted gently. I know you're not ready. I know you're still carrying ghosts, but I wanted you to know. That when you are ready, I'm here.
She stood and went back inside before he could respond. Caleb sat alone in the darkness, his heart hammering. He thought about Emma, about the vow he'd made at her grave never to love anyone again, never to risk that kind of pain. But he also thought about Lydia's smile, about Eliza's laugh, about the way the house he'd built looked with smoke curling from its chimney. The dead couldn't hold you forever. Eventually you had to choose. Keep running or stand still and let life find you again. The next morning brought trouble. Caleb was at the livery when Sheriff Brennan rode up hard, his horse lathered and blowing. "We've got a problem," Brennan said without preamble. "The Carver gang hit the bank in Red Creek last night, killed 2 people, took everything." Caleb felt his stomach drop. The Carver gang was notorious, a group of ex-Confederate raiders who'd turned to robbery after the war. They were brutal, efficient, and smart enough to avoid capture for 3 years. "How close is Red Creek?" he asked. 30 miles northeast. Brennan dismounted, his face grim. "They're heading this way, moving fast, trying to get ahead of the law. You think they'll come through Coopersville? It's the logical route if they're heading for the mountains. And if they do—" Brennan didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. "How many men can you raise?" Caleb asked. "Maybe a dozen. Enough to defend the town if it comes to that. But I'm hoping they'll just ride through." Men like that don't just ride through. Not if they see something they want. Brennan's jaw tightened. "I know." Within an hour, the town was buzzing with the news. People shuttered their windows, brought their livestock in close, checked their weapons. The men gathered at the sheriff's office, faces tense. Caleb stood with them, his rifle across his chest, listening as Brennan laid out a plan. They'd post lookouts on the north road, keep the main street clear, be ready to ford up in the stone church if things went bad. "With luck," Brennan said, "they won't even notice us. We're small, we're poor, we're not worth the trouble." But Caleb could see the doubt in his eyes, could see it in all their eyes. That night, Lydia found him checking his weapons in the small barn behind the house. "You're going to fight," she said. It wasn't a question. "If it comes to it." "Caleb, you don't have to—" "Yes, I do." He set down the rifle, turned to face her. "These people took me in, fed me, gave me work, made me part of something. I'm not going to hide while they face this alone." "What about us?" Her voice was small. "What about Eliza?" "That's exactly why I have to do this, to keep you safe, both of you." Lydia was silent for a long moment. Then she stepped forward and kissed him, brief, fierce, full of everything they hadn't said. "Come back," she whispered against his lips. "Promise me you'll come back." "I promise." It was a promise he didn't know if he could keep. The Carver gang rode into Coopersville just after dawn 2 days later. Caleb saw them from his position on the roof of the general store. 8 men on horseback, heavily armed, moving with the casual confidence of people who'd never been stopped. They weren't trying to hide. They owned the road and they knew it. The lead rider was a big man with a scarred face and eyes like chips of ice. Frank Carver himself. Caleb had seen his wanted poster enough times to recognize him. The gang stopped in the middle of the main street, looking around with the appraising eyes of predators sizing up prey. "Nice little town," Carver said, his voice carrying in the morning stillness. "Quiet. Peaceful. Be a shame if something happened to it." Sheriff Brennan stepped out of his office, his badge catching the early light. Behind him, 6 men emerged from doorways and alleys, weapons ready but not raised. "Morning, gentlemen," Brennan said evenly. "Just passing through?" Carver smiled. It wasn't a pleasant expression. "That depends. How friendly are you folks?" "Friendly enough, as long as you don't cause trouble." "Trouble." Carver seemed to taste the word. "Now that's interesting. See, we've been riding hard for 2 days. My men are tired, hungry, could use a place to rest, maybe some supplies. We've got a restaurant, general store. Help yourselves, long as you pay." "Pay." Carver's smile widened. "Yeah, about that. Thing is, we're a little short on cash right now. Thought maybe you good people might extend us some credit." The threat hung in the air, naked and undeniable. Brennan's hand moved toward his gun. "Can't do that." Everything happened at once. One of Carver's men drew and fired, the shot shattering the window behind Brennan. The sheriff dove for cover as his deputies opened up, gunfire erupting along the street. Caleb sighted down his rifle and fired. One of the gang members jerked and fell from his saddle. Caleb worked the lever, fired again. The horses were screaming, plunging, making it hard to hit anything. Carver wheeled his mount, pointing toward the general store. There, on the roof! Bullets chewed into the roofline around Caleb. He rolled back, came up firing. Below, the street had become a killing ground. Men running, shooting, dying. The acrid smell of gunpowder filled the air. One of Carver's men made it to the general store entrance and kicked in the door. Caleb heard screaming from inside. Mary Peterson, who ran the store. He dropped through the roof hatch, hit the floor hard, and came up running. The gang member was dragging Mary toward the back, one hand clamped over her mouth. Caleb didn't hesitate. He fired once, the bullet taking the man in the shoulder. The man spun, raising his pistol, and Caleb fired again. The man dropped. Get to the church! Caleb shouted at Mary. She ran, sobbing. Outside, the gunfire was intensifying. Caleb moved to the window and saw Carver and his remaining men had taken cover behind a water trough. They had the street pinned down and Brennan's men couldn't get a clear shot. Caleb made a decision. He slipped out the back door, circled around through the alley, came up behind the trough. The gang members were focused forward, didn't see him approach. He fired twice, fast. 2 men fell. Carver whirled, his face twisted with rage, and their eyes met across 15 feet of dirt and blood. You! Carver snarled. He raised his pistol. Caleb was faster. The bullet caught Carver in the chest, punching him backward. He hit the ground hard, coughed blood, and lay still. The remaining gang members looked at their dead leader, then at each other. One of them raised his hand slowly. We're done, he said. Don't shoot. The gunfight had lasted maybe 3 minutes. It felt like hours. In the aftermath, the town counted its wounds. 2 men dead, a deputy and Bill Henderson, who'd taken a bullet defending the bank. 5 wounded, none seriously. The Carver gang was finished. 4 dead, including Frank Carver himself, and 4 captured. Caleb sat on the steps of the general store, suddenly exhausted. His hands were shaking, his ears ringing from the gunfire. He'd killed 3 men in as many minutes, and the weight of it pressed down on his chest like a stone. Lydia found him there. She didn't say anything, just sat beside him and took his hand. Her fingers were cold but steady. Is it over? She asked quietly. Yeah, it's over. They sat in silence, watching the town begin to pick up the pieces. Dr. Hartwell was moving between the wounded, her face set in grim concentration. Mrs. Chen was organizing women to bring water and bandages. Tommy Chen was helping his grandmother, his young face older than it should be. You saved them, Lydia said. All of us. Bill Henderson's dead. So is Tom Riley. I didn't save them. You saved everyone else. She squeezed his hand. You can't save everyone, Caleb. You can only do your best. He looked at her. This woman who'd survived so much, who'd lost her husband and nearly died herself, who still had the strength to comfort him when he needed it. I love you, he said. The words came out rough, uncertain. I don't know when it happened, but it did. And I'm terrified. Lydia's eyes filled with tears. I love you too, and I'm terrified too. She leaned her head against his shoulder. But maybe that's okay. Maybe being terrified means it matters. Behind them, the door opened. Sheriff Brennan stepped out, looking 20 years older than he had that morning. The prisoners are secure, he said. We'll take them to the territorial capital for trial. He looked at Caleb. That was some shooting. Where'd you learn to handle a gun like that? Here and there, Brennan nodded, not pressing. Town council wants to thank you proper. There's talk of making you a deputy, if you're interested. I'm not. Figured you'd say that. Brennan smiled faintly. But the offer stands. You ever change your mind? He tipped his hat and walked away. That night, Caleb stood in the house he'd built, looking at the empty rooms. Tomorrow he'd start furnishing them, building furniture, making curtains, all the small things that turned a house into a home. But tonight, he just stood there, letting himself feel the weight of what had happened. The men he'd killed, the lives he'd saved, the choice he'd made to stand and fight instead of running. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. It was Lydia, carrying Eliza. The baby was asleep, her small face peaceful. I thought you might be here, Lydia said. Thought you might not want to be alone. I wasn't sure I wanted company. Too bad. She came inside, looked around at the bare rooms. It's a good house, Caleb. Strong. Built to last. Like the man who built it? She smiled. I hope so. They stood together in the empty house, the only sound Eliza's soft breathing. Outside, Coopersville was settling down for the night. Lamps being lit, doors being locked, families gathering together in the aftermath of violence. Stay, Caleb said quietly. Tonight. Here. With me. Lydia looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded. They made a bed of blankets on the floor of the larger room. Eliza slept between them, a small, warm presence. Caleb lay awake long after Lydia's breathing had evened out into sleep, staring at the ceiling. He thought about Emma, about the life he'd lost, about 7 years of running, of refusing to let himself care about anything or anyone. But he also thought about Lydia's hand in his, about Eliza's smile, about a town that had given him a place when he'd needed one most. The past couldn't be undone. The dead couldn't be brought back. But the living could build something new, could take broken pieces and make them whole again, could choose to stay instead of run. Caleb reached out, gently touched Eliza's soft hair. The baby stirred but didn't wake. I'm staying, he whispered to the darkness. This time I'm staying. And for the first time in 7 years, he believed it. The morning came soft and golden, light streaming through the unfinished windows. Caleb woke to find Lydia already up, standing in the doorway and looking out at the town. It's beautiful, she said when she heard him stir. From here, you can see the whole valley. He joined her, Eliza cradled in his arms. The baby was awake, looking around with her dark, curious eyes. Below them, Coopersville was coming to life. Smoke rising from chimneys, people emerging from houses, the sound of hammers and saws as repairs began on the damaged buildings. We should get married, Lydia said suddenly. Caleb looked at her, startled. What? We should get married. You and me. She turned to face him, her expression earnest. Not because we have to. Not because it's expected, but because I want to. Because you want to. Don't you? He thought about it for exactly 3 seconds. Yeah, he said. I do. Her smile was like the sun coming up. Then it settled. Just like that? Just like that. She took Eliza from him, kissed the baby's forehead, then kissed Caleb. We've both spent enough time being afraid. Time to be brave instead. Caleb laughed. A real laugh. Full and genuine. You're the bravest person I know. Then I'm in good company. They stood together in the doorway of their unfinished house, watching the town rebuild itself, watching life continue in the way it always did, stubborn, resilient, refusing to be stopped. And Caleb felt something he hadn't felt in 7 years. Hope. The wedding was set for the first Saturday in June, when the wildflowers would be blooming across the valley and the last threat of frost had passed. Lydia insisted on keeping it simple. No fuss, no elaborate ceremony, just a gathering of the people who mattered in the small church on the hill. But Coopersville had other ideas. Mrs. Chen took charge of the food preparation with the intensity of a general marshaling troops. Sarah Hartwell volunteered to make Lydia's dress, enlisting 3 other women to help with the sewing. Tommy Chen and his friends spent a week gathering wildflowers from the meadows, filling every available jar and bucket. Even Sheriff Brennan got involved, organizing a work party to paint the church and repair its sagging steps. I told them to keep it simple, Lydia said one evening, watching through the window as yet another wagon arrived bearing supplies. This is getting out of hand. Caleb wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. Let them have their celebration. The town needs something good after everything that happened. You're not worried about all the attention? Terrified. He said it lightly, but she heard the truth underneath. But I'm doing it anyway. She turned in his arms, studying his face. You know you don't have to prove anything, right? Not to me, not to anyone. I know. He kissed her forehead. But maybe I need to prove it to myself. That I can do this. That I can stay. Eliza, who'd been playing on a blanket with wooden blocks Caleb had carved, chose that moment to pull herself up to standing, wobbling on unsteady legs. She took one lurching step forward, then another, her face split in a triumphant grin. "Caleb!" Lydia gasped. "She's walking!" They both dropped to their knees, arms outstretched. Eliza took 3 more wobbly steps before falling into Caleb's hands, laughing with pure delight. "Look at you," Caleb said, his voice rough with emotion. "Already running before you can walk." "She gets that from someone," Lydia said pointedly. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of preparation. Caleb finished the furniture for the house, a bed frame, a table, chairs, a cradle for Eliza that he carved with infinite care. He wasn't skilled at woodworking, but what he lacked in finesse he made up for in determination. Each piece was solid, built to last, built for a life he was finally allowing himself to imagine. In the evenings, after Eliza was asleep, he and Lydia would sit on the porch of the boarding house and talk. About everything and nothing. About their pasts, their fears, their hopes for the future. About the children they might have, the life they would build together. "I never thought I'd have this again," Caleb admitted one night. "After Emma died, I was certain that was it. One chance, and I'd wasted it." "You didn't waste anything," Lydia said firmly. "You loved her. You gave her everything you had. That's not a waste." "But I couldn't save her." "No." Lydia took his hand. "But you saved me. And Eliza. And maybe that's what you were meant to do all along. You believe in that? Meant to be?" She was quiet for a moment, considering.
"I believe that bad things happen, terrible things. Samuel dying, me almost dying, you losing Emma. None of that was meant to be. It was just cruel and random and unfair." She looked at him. "But I also believe we get to choose what we do with the pain. We can let it destroy us, or we can use it to build something new, something beautiful." "Is that what we're doing?" "I hope so." The night before the wedding, Caleb couldn't sleep. He lay in his bed at the boarding house, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing. Tomorrow, he would stand in front of the whole town and make promises he wasn't sure he could keep. Tomorrow, he would bind his life to Lydia's, to Eliza's, to this place. Tomorrow, he would stop running. The thought should have terrified him, and it did. But beneath the terror was something else, something that felt almost like peace. A soft knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. "Caleb?" Sheriff Brennan's voice. "You awake?" Caleb opened the door to find Brennan standing in the hallway, still fully dressed despite the late hour. "Couldn't sleep either?" Caleb asked. "Too old for sleep." Brennan smiled faintly. "Got a minute?" They ended up on the porch, sharing a bottle of whiskey Brennan had brought. The night was clear and cool, stars scattered across the sky like diamonds on black velvet. "You nervous?" Brennan asked after a while. "What gave it away?" "The fact that you're awake at 2 in the morning." Brennan took a drink, passed the bottle. "I was the same way before I married Ruth. Spent the whole night convinced I was making a mistake, that I wasn't good enough for her, that I'd ruin everything." "How'd you get past it?" "I didn't. I was still terrified when I walked down that aisle." Brennan smiled at the memory, but then I saw her face, and suddenly none of the fear mattered. "Mom, because whatever else happened, whatever mistakes I made, we'd face them together." "How long were you married?" 32 years. She died 5 winters ago." Brennan's voice was steady, but there was an old grief beneath it. "Best 32 years of my life, and I'd do it all again in a heartbeat, even knowing how it ends." They sat in companionable silence, passing the bottle back and forth. "You're a good man, Caleb," Brennan said eventually. "Better than you think you are. And Lydia knows it. That little girl knows it. Hell, the whole town knows it. Maybe it's time you knew it too." Caleb didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing. But something in his chest loosened slightly, some knot of tension he'd been carrying for so long he'd forgotten it was there. "There's something else," Brennan continued, his tone shifting. "Something I need to tell you before tomorrow." Caleb looked at him sharply. "What is it?" "A man came through town 3 days ago, asked questions about you, about where you came from, what you'd done before you got here." The whiskey turned sour in Caleb's stomach. "What kind of man?" "Bounty hunter, if I had to guess. Didn't give a name, but he had that look. Hard eyes, careful movements, professional." "What did you tell him?" "Nothing. Told him I didn't know anyone by that name." Brennan met Caleb's eyes. "But he's still around.
I've seen him watching the boarding house, the livery. He's waiting for something. Caleb's mind raced through possibilities. He'd never been an outlaw, never had a price on his head, but he drifted through a lot of places, crossed paths with a lot of people. Maybe someone from his past had caught up with him. "You think he's coming for me?" Caleb asked quietly. "I think he's sizing you up, trying to figure out if you're worth the trouble." Brennan leaned forward. "Question is, are you? Is there something in your past that could come back to bite you?" Caleb thought about the years after Emma's death. The drinking, the drifting, the fights in saloons where he'd been too angry to care if he lived or died. He'd never killed anyone who didn't deserve it, never stolen anything that wasn't already his. But he'd made enemies. That was the nature of the life he'd lived. "Nothing I'm ashamed of," he said finally. "But that doesn't mean someone isn't looking for revenge." "Then we deal with it, together." Brennan stood, steadied himself against the porch railing. "Get some sleep, Caleb. Tomorrow's a big day, and whatever happens after, we'll face it when it comes." After Brennan left, Caleb sat alone on the porch, the weight of this new threat settling over him like a shroud. He'd been so focused on building a future that he'd forgotten the past had claws. But he wasn't running, not this time. Whatever came, he would face it. For Lydia, for Eliza, for the life he'd chosen. The morning of the wedding dawned bright and clear. Caleb stood in front of the small mirror in his room, struggling with the tie Mrs. Chen had insisted he wear. His hands were shaking slightly, making the task nearly impossible. A knock at the door. Tommy Chen poked his head in, grinning. "Grandma sent me to make sure you didn't run away," the boy said. "I'm not running." "That's what they all say." Tommy came in, expertly fixed Caleb's tie. "My uncle ran away 3 times before his wedding. Grandma had to chase him down each time." "Did he eventually get married?" "Yeah, they've been happy for 20 years. Tommy stepped back, surveying his work. "You look good, Mr. Rourke, like a real gentleman." "Don't push it, kid." The walk to the church felt longer than it should have. People lined the street, waving and calling out congratulations. Children threw flower petals. Mrs. Chen watched from her porch with a satisfied expression, as if she'd personally arranged the whole thing. But Caleb's eyes kept scanning the crowd, looking for the stranger Brennan had warned him about. Looking for trouble. The church was packed, every pew filled, people standing along the walls. Caleb took his place at the front, Sheriff Brennan standing beside him as his witness. His heart was hammering so hard he was certain everyone could hear it. Then the doors opened and Lydia appeared. She was beautiful, not in the elaborate, fussy way of society weddings Caleb had seen in photographs, but in a simple, honest way that took his breath. Her dress was cream-colored cotton, perfectly fitted, with wildflowers woven into her hair. She carried Eliza on her hip, the baby wearing a tiny white dress and looking around with wide, curious eyes. Lydia walked down the aisle alone, her head held high, her eyes locked on Caleb's. When she reached the front, she handed Eliza to Sarah Hartwell and took Caleb's hands. "Hi," she whispered. "Hi," he managed. The ceremony was brief. The minister, a circuit preacher who'd arrived that morning, spoke about commitment and faith in building a life together. Caleb barely heard the words. He was too focused on Lydia's face, on her hands in his, on the reality of this moment. "Do you, Caleb Rourke, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" Caleb thought about the night in the snow, about Lydia's scream cutting through the wind, thought about delivering Eliza in the dirt and cold, about fighting to keep them alive, about every choice that had led to this moment. "I do," he said, and meant it with everything he had. "And do you, Lydia Hale, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" Lydia's eyes were shining with tears. "I do." "Then by the power vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife." Caleb kissed her, and the church erupted in cheers. The celebration afterward was everything Coopersville had promised, food and music and dancing that lasted well into the night. Caleb found himself pulled into conversation after conversation, shaking hands, accepting congratulations, feeling more connected to these people than he'd felt to anyone in years. But through it all, he remained vigilant, watching, waiting. The stranger never appeared. As the sun began to set, Caleb found himself at the edge of the gathering, watching Lydia dance with Eliza in her arms. The baby was laughing, delighted by the spinning and the music. Lydia looked over and caught his eye, her smile radiant. Then Caleb saw him. A man standing in the shadows at the edge of the crowd, watching. Tall, lean, with a gun belt visible beneath his coat. Their eyes met across the distance, and the man nodded once, a gesture that could have meant anything or nothing. Caleb's hand moved instinctively toward where his revolver would have been if he'd been wearing it. But he'd left his weapons at home, had promised Lydia he wouldn't carry them to the wedding. The stranger turned and walked away, disappearing into the gathering dusk. Brennan appeared at Caleb's elbow, following his gaze. That him? Yeah. Want me to go after him? Caleb watched the spot where the stranger had been, his jaw tight. No, not tonight. Tonight's about Lydia and Eliza. The rest can wait. You sure? I'm sure. But later that night, after they'd returned to their new house and Eliza was asleep in her cradle, Caleb told Lydia about the stranger. She listened without interrupting, her face growing pale in the lamplight. What does he want? She asked when he finished. I don't know. Maybe nothing. Maybe he's just passing through. You don't believe that. No. He took her hands. But whatever it is, whatever he wants, I'll handle it. I promise. Caleb, if this is dangerous, it won't touch you or Eliza. I'll make sure of that. She searched his face, then nodded slowly. What do? We live our lives. We don't let fear control us. He pulled her close. And we trust that whatever comes, we'll face it together. They stood in their new house, holding each other, listening to Eliza's soft breathing from the next room. And despite the threat lurking in the shadows, despite the uncertainty of what tomorrow might bring, they felt safe, because they had each other. And sometimes, that was enough. The next morning brought answers Caleb hadn't expected. He was at the livery, mucking stalls, and trying not to think about the stranger, when Sheriff Brennan arrived with a telegram. This came for you, Brennan said, his expression unreadable. From the Territorial Marshal's office. Caleb wiped his hands on his pants, took the telegram with a sense of dread. The message was brief. Caleb Rourke. Stop inquiry regarding incident Silverdale, Montana. Stop your testimony required. Stop. Marshal William Cross en route. Stop. Caleb's blood ran cold. Silverdale. 3 years ago. A mining town where he'd been working as a guard for a silver shipment. There'd been a robbery, a gunfight, men dead on both sides. He'd given his statement to the local law and moved on. Thought it was finished. Apparently not. The stranger, Caleb said quietly. He's a marshal? Looks that way. Brennan took the telegram back, read it again. What happened in Silverdale? Caleb told him. About the robbery, the fight. The 3 men he'd killed defending the shipment. It was clean. Self-defense. The local sheriff cleared me. Then why's the marshal coming now? I don't know. Maybe new evidence? Maybe someone's claiming I acted improperly. Caleb felt anger rising in his chest. Or maybe someone's looking to settle a score and found a legal way to do it. What are you going to do? What can I do? I'll tell the truth, same as I did 3 years ago. He looked at Brennan. You believe me? I believe you're not the kind of man who'd kill without cause. Brennan clapped him on the shoulder. And I'll testify to your character if it comes to that. So will half the town. The marshal arrived 2 days later, a weathered man in his 50s with gray hair and eyes that had seen too much. William Cross didn't look like trouble, but Caleb had learned long ago that the most dangerous men rarely did. They met in Sheriff Brennan's office, Caleb sitting across the desk from Cross, while Brennan stood in the corner. Mr. Rourke, Cross began, pulling out a worn notebook. Thank you for agreeing to speak with me. Didn't know I had a choice. You always have a choice, but cooperation tends to make things easier. Cross flipped through his notes. 3 years ago, you were working as a guard for the Silverdale Mining Company. On the night of April 15th, you were part of a detail transporting a silver shipment when you were attacked by 4 men. Is that correct? Yes. And in the ensuing gunfight, 3 of the attackers were killed. You killed all 3. That's right. They came at us shooting. It was them or us. The 4th attacker escaped. He did. We tried to track him, but lost him in the hills. Cross leaned back, studying Caleb's face. That 4th man was recently captured in Idaho. He's claiming the robbery was an inside job. that you were working with the gang, that you killed your partners to increase your share of the take. Caleb felt the bottom drop out of his stomach. That's a lie. Is it? Because he's got details. Knows things about the shipment that only someone on the inside would know. Then he got them from someone else. Not me. Caleb's voice was hard. I was cleared. The local law investigated and found no evidence of wrongdoing. The local sheriff was also shot during the robbery, died 2 weeks later from his wounds. Convenient, wouldn't you say? Convenient? Caleb stood, his chair scraping back. That man was my friend. I rode with him for 6 months. And you're suggesting I had something to do with his death? I'm suggesting it's odd that the only people who could corroborate your story are dead. Not all of them. Caleb forced himself to calm down, sit back down. There was another guard, Frank Morrison. He survived the attack, testified that everything happened the way I said. Frank Morrison disappeared a year ago. No one's seen him since. The implication hung in the air like smoke. I didn't touch him, Caleb said quietly. I haven't seen Morrison since I left Silverdale. Can you prove that? Can you prove I did? Cross smiled faintly. Fair point. He closed his notebook. Here's the situation, Mr. Rourke. I've got a witness claiming you're a murderer and a thief. I've got convenient deaths and disappearances. And I've got you, living under a new name in a town where nobody knows your history. I'm not living under a new name. Rourke is my name. But you didn't mention Silverdale when you came to Coopersville, did you? Didn't tell anyone about the robbery or the deaths. Why would I? It was in my past. I'd been cleared. I wanted to move on. Or you wanted to hide? Brennan stepped forward. Marshal, I've known Caleb for 6 months now. He's proven himself to be honest, brave, and reliable. He saved lives during the Carver gang attack. He's building a life here, contributing to the community. That doesn't sound like a man on the run. Or it sounds like a man building an alibi. Cross stood. Mr. Rourke, I'm going to need you to come with me to the territorial capital. There'll be a hearing, and you'll have a chance to defend yourself properly. When? We leave in 3 days. Caleb felt the walls closing in. How long will this take? Depends on what we find. Could be a week. Could be months. Cross's expression softened slightly. I understand you just got married, that this is difficult timing, but I have my job to do. And if I refuse, then I'll arrest you and take you anyway. But I'm hoping it doesn't come to that. After Cross left, Caleb sat in Brennan's office, his head in his hands. This is bad, he said. It's not good, Brennan agreed, but it's not hopeless. You've got witnesses here who can testify to your character. You've got me backing you up. And if you're telling the truth about Silverdale, I am, then the truth will come out. It always does. But Caleb knew that wasn't always true. He'd seen innocent men hang because the wrong people told the right lies. He'd seen guilty men walk free because they had money or influence or just plain luck. He thought about Lydia, about the promise he'd made just 2 days ago, about Eliza, who called him Papa now, and reached for him whenever she was scared. He couldn't leave them, not now, not like this. But he also couldn't run. Running would make him look guilty, would confirm every suspicion Cross had, and it would mean giving up everything he'd built, everything he'd fought for. There was no good choice, only less bad ones. That evening, he told Lydia everything, about Silverdale, about the robbery, about the marshal's accusations. She listened without interrupting, her face growing pale but her eyes never leaving his. Do you believe me? He asked when he finished. Of course I believe you. She took his hands. You're not capable of what he's accusing you of. You don't know that. You've only known me for 6 months. I know you delivered my baby in a snowstorm. I know you fought to keep me alive when I should have died. I know you built us a home with your own hands. Her grip tightened. I know your heart, Caleb, and whatever happened in Silverdale, I know you didn't murder anyone in cold blood. He pulled her close, breathing in the scent of her hair. I have to go with him, to the capital. If I don't, it'll look like I'm running. Then we'll come with you. Lydia, no. The journey's hard, and with Eliza, we're coming. Her voice was firm. We're a family now. We face things together. That's what you told me, remember? He did remember, and despite the fear gnawing at his gut, he felt something else too. gratitude that he wasn't facing this alone. "All right," he said. "We'll all go." The next 3 days were a blur of preparation. Caleb arranged for someone to take over his work at the livery. Lydia packed clothes and supplies for the journey. Sheriff Brennan wrote letters of recommendation, gathered statements from townspeople attesting to Caleb's character. Mrs. Chen was beside herself. "This is wrong," she said, her voice sharp with anger. "That marshal, he comes here, makes accusations, takes you away from family. Wrong." "It's just a hearing," Caleb said, trying to calm her. "I'll tell the truth and they'll see there's nothing to the charges." "And if they don't see?" Mrs. Chen's eyes were fierce. "What then?" Caleb didn't have an answer for that. On the morning of their departure, half the town showed up to see them off. Dr. Hartwell brought medicine for the journey. Tommy Chen gave Caleb a carved wooden horse for luck. Even Marcus Hale had sent a telegram offering support and legal assistance if needed. Marshal Cross watched the display with an unreadable expression. "You've made quite an impression here," he said to Caleb. "I've tried to be a good neighbor." "Or you've worked very hard to make people trust you." Cross mounted his horse. "Either way, we'll find out the truth soon enough." The journey to the territorial capital took 5 days. They traveled by wagon, Lydia and Eliza riding inside while Caleb drove and Cross rode alongside. The marshal kept a careful distance, not hostile but not friendly either. At night, they camped under the stars. Caleb would hold Eliza while Lydia prepared dinner, the baby babbling happily and pointing at the fire. In those moments, it was easy to forget why they were making this journey. Easy to pretend they were just a family on an adventure. But then Caleb would catch Cross watching him with those calculating eyes, and reality would crash back. On the third night, as they sat around the fire, Cross finally spoke about more than just logistics. "Tell me about your wife," he said. "The one who died." Caleb stiffened. "That's personal." "Everything's personal in an investigation." Cross poked at the fire with a stick. "Humor me." Caleb looked at Lydia, who nodded encouragement. "Her name was Emma," he said quietly. "We were married for 3 years. She died in childbirth along with the baby." "And after that, you started drifting." "Yeah. Working whatever jobs you could find, never staying anywhere long." "That's right. Must have been lonely." It was. Caleb met Cross's eyes. "What's your point?" "My point is that people in pain sometimes make bad choices. Sometimes they do things they wouldn't normally do because they're hurt or angry or desperate. I didn't rob that shipment. Maybe not. But maybe you saw an opportunity and took it. Maybe you figured you deserved something good after all the bad." Cross leaned back. "I'm not saying you're a monster, Rourke. I'm saying you're human. And humans are capable of anything under the right circumstances." "Not me. Not that." Cross studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "We'll see." They reached the territorial capital on the afternoon of the 5th day, a sprawling town built around the government buildings, larger and more chaotic than anything Coopersville could imagine. Caleb had been here once before, years ago, and it hadn't improved. Cross directed them to a boarding house near the courthouse. "You're not under arrest," he said, "but I'd appreciate it if you didn't leave town until this is resolved." "Where would I go?" Caleb asked bitterly. The hearing was set for 2 days later, giving Caleb time to find a lawyer. He chose a man named Edward Hayes, older, experienced, with a reputation for honesty if not brilliance. Hayes listened to Caleb's story, took notes, asked pointed questions. "This is going to come down to credibility," Hayes said finally. "Your word against the survivors. The question is, who will the judge believe?" "I'm telling the truth." "I believe you. But we need more than that. We need evidence, witnesses, something concrete. The only other witness is Morrison, and he's disappeared. Then we'll have to make do with what we have." Hayes stood gathering his papers. "Character witnesses from Coopersville will help. Letters from the sheriff, the doctor, prominent citizens. We'll paint a picture of a man who's turned his life around, who's contributing to his community. That counts for something." "Will it be enough?" Hayes met his eyes. "Honestly, I don't know." The night before the hearing, Caleb couldn't sleep. He stood at the window of their boarding house room, watching the streets below. Lydia came to stand beside him, wrapping her arms around his waist. "It's going to be all right," she said. "You don't know that." "No, but I believe it anyway." She turned him to face her.
Whatever happens tomorrow, we'll get through it, together. What if they find me guilty? What if they— Stop! She pressed her fingers to his lips. We're not there yet. Don't borrow tomorrow's trouble. He kissed her, trying to memorize the taste, the feel, the warmth of her, just in case.
The hearing began at 9 the next morning in a stuffy courtroom that smelled of old wood and older secrets. Judge Marcus Blackwood presided, a severe man with white hair and eyes like chips of flint. The survivor from the robbery, a weaselly man named Jack Coburn, testified first. He spun a tale of Caleb approaching him months before the robbery, proposing they work together to steal the shipment. He described meetings, plans, Caleb's promise that no one would get hurt. It was all lies, but Coburn told them convincingly. Hayes cross-examined, poking holes where he could. How did Caleb contact him? Where did these supposed meetings take place? If Caleb was planning this, why did he kill 3 of his co-conspirators? He got greedy, Coburn said. Wanted the whole take for himself. When the others argued, he shot them. And what about the sheriff who died? Was that part of the plan? No, that was Caleb being careless. He shot Wild during the fight, hit the sheriff by accident. Caleb wanted to lunge across the courtroom and strangle the lying bastard. Lydia's hand on his arm was the only thing that kept him in his seat. Then it was Caleb's turn. He told the truth, simple, direct, unembellished. He described the attack, the fight, the deaths. He explained that he'd never met Coburn before that night, had no idea who he was beyond being one of the men trying to kill him. Why should we believe you over Mr. Coburn? The judge asked. Because I have no reason to lie. I was cleared 3 years ago. I moved on with my life. If I was guilty, why would I risk everything by staying in one place, building a home, getting married? Why wouldn't I keep running? Perhaps you thought enough time had passed, that you were safe. Or perhaps I'm innocent. Hayes called character witnesses, Sheriff Brennan, who'd traveled to the Capitol to testify. Dr. Hartwell, who spoke about Caleb's actions during Eliza's birth. Even Mrs. Chen, who'd made the journey despite her age and lectured the judge in broken English about the importance of seeing a man's heart. By the end of the day, Caleb was exhausted. The judge called a recess, said he'd render his decision the next morning. That night was the longest of Caleb's life. He held Eliza, played with her, memorized every detail of her face. He made love to Lydia slowly, tenderly, as if it might be the last time. He tried to prepare himself for the possibility that tomorrow he'd be in chains, headed for a prison cell or worse. I love you, he told Lydia as they lay in the darkness. Whatever happens, I need you to know that. I know. I love you too. Her voice was steady despite the tears on her face. And I'm not giving up on you, no matter what that judge says. Morning came too quickly. They gathered in the courtroom, Caleb, Lydia holding Eliza, Hayes, Marshall Cross, and a handful of spectators. Judge Blackwood entered, his face revealing nothing. I've reviewed the testimony and evidence, he began. This is a difficult case. We have 2 conflicting accounts and very little physical evidence to support either one. Caleb's heart hammered against his ribs. However, Blackwood continued, I must consider not just the accusations, but the credibility of those making them. Mr. Coburn is a known criminal with every reason to lie in order to reduce his own sentence. Mr. Rourke, on the other hand, has demonstrated through his actions in Coopersville that he is a man of character and integrity. Hope flickered in Caleb's chest. That said, I cannot simply dismiss the charges. There are too many unanswered questions, too many convenient absences of evidence. Blackwood paused. Therefore, I'm ruling as follows. The charges against Caleb Rourke are dismissed due to insufficient evidence. However, this matter remains open. Should new evidence emerge, it may be revisited. Relief crashed over Caleb like a wave. Dismissed. He was free. Beside him, Lydia was crying, clutching Eliza and trying not to make noise. Hayes was smiling, gathering his papers. Even Marshall Cross looked satisfied, as if this was the outcome he'd expected. Mr.
Rourke, Blackwood said, his tone stern. You're free to go, but I suggest you conduct yourself in such a manner that you never find yourself in my courtroom again. Yes, Your Honor. Thank you. Outside the courthouse, Caleb stood in the sunlight and breathed deeply, as if tasting freedom for the first time. Lydia wrapped her arms around him, Eliza squashed between them, all three of them laughing and crying at once. "It's over," Lydia said. "It's really over." "Yeah."
Caleb kissed her forehead, then Eliza's. "Let's go home." The journey back to Coopersville was lighter, faster, full of relief and joy. When they arrived, the town turned out to greet them, cheering and celebrating as if Caleb had returned from war. Mrs. Chen hugged him so hard he thought his ribs might crack. Tommy Chen wanted to hear every detail of the trial. Sheriff Brennan just smiled and said, "Told you the truth would come out." That night, in their own house, with Eliza asleep in her cradle and the familiar sounds of Coopersville settling down for the night, Caleb and Lydia finally relaxed. "I was so scared," Lydia admitted. "I kept thinking about what I'd do if they took you away, how I'd explain it to Eliza when she got older. But they didn't. We made it through." "We did." She looked at him. "But Caleb, that judge said the case could be reopened. What if—" "Then we'll deal with it together." He pulled her close. "I'm not afraid anymore. Not of the past, not of what might come. Because I know that whatever happens, I have you. And that's enough." Summer turned to fall and fall to winter. Life in Coopersville continued its steady rhythm. Caleb expanded his work at the livery, eventually buying it outright when the previous owner retired. Lydia's cooking became legendary, with people traveling from neighboring towns just to taste her pies. Eliza grew from a toddler into a bright, curious child who asked endless questions and got into endless trouble. She had Caleb's eyes and Lydia's determination, and watching her grow was like witnessing a miracle unfold daily. On their first anniversary, Caleb and Lydia stood on the porch of their house, watching the sun set over the valley. Eliza was inside, supposedly napping, but more likely playing with her toys. "Happy anniversary," Lydia said, leaning against him. "Happy anniversary." He kissed the top of her head. "Any regrets?" "Not a single one. You?" "Only that I didn't find you sooner." She laughed. "If you'd found me sooner, we might not have been ready for each other. Sometimes the timing has to be right." Wise words from Mrs. Rourke. "I have my moments." They stood in comfortable silence, watching the light fade from gold to orange to deep purple. Somewhere in the town below, a dog barked. A baby cried and was soothed. The sound of a piano drifted up from the saloon. Normal. Everyday. Beautiful. "Caleb?" Lydia said after a while. "Yeah, I'm pregnant." For a moment he couldn't breathe. Then he was laughing, lifting her and spinning her around, both of them giddy with joy and hope and the beautiful certainty of tomorrow. "When?" he managed. "Late spring, Sarah thinks. Maybe early summer." A baby. Their baby. His second chance not just at love, but at the family he'd lost so long ago. "I love you," he said, the words inadequate, but all he had. "I love you too." She kissed him. "We're going to be all right, aren't we?" "Yeah," Caleb said, looking out at the town that had become his home, at the life he'd built from nothing but determination and hope. "We're going to be just fine." The baby, a boy they named Samuel after Lydia's first husband, was born the following June on a warm afternoon when the wildflowers were blooming across the valley. The labor was easier this time, with Dr. Hartwell attending and no snowstorm in sight. When Caleb held his son for the first time, he thought about Emma, about the child they'd lost, and felt something in his chest that had been broken for so long finally begin to heal. Eliza was fascinated by her new brother, insisted on helping with everything from diaper changes to feeding. She'd appointed herself his protector, this fierce little girl who'd come into the world during a blizzard and decided she'd fight just as hard for those she loved. Years passed. The house grew with additions and improvements. The livery expanded into a successful business. Samuel learned to walk, then to run, then to ride. Eliza started school and showed a natural talent for numbers that had the teacher suggesting she might become a bookkeeper someday. Caleb's hair started to gray at the temples. Lydia developed laugh lines around her eyes. They grew older together, weathering the storms that came. Harsh winters, dry summers, the occasional crisis that tested their strength but never broke it. One autumn evening, when Caleb was 45 and Lydia 42, they sat on their porch watching their children play in the yard. Samuel was 8 now, Eliza 13, and already showing signs of the beautiful woman she'd become. Do you ever think about that night? Lydia asked. The night you found me? Every day, Caleb admitted. Still can't believe I almost rode past. What made you stop? He'd thought about that question 1,000 times over the years, had examined it from every angle, trying to understand the impulse that had changed everything. I think, he said slowly, that I was tired of running, tired of being alone. And when I heard you scream, it was like the universe was giving me one last chance to be something more than what I'd become. He looked at her. So I took it. Best decision you ever made? Second best. What was the first? Staying. He took her hand. Choosing to build a life instead of running from one. That's the one that mattered. Lydia rested her head on his shoulder. I'm glad you stayed. So am I. As the sun set and the children's laughter filled the air, Caleb thought about all the years behind him and all the years still to come. He thought about Emma and the life they'd had, about the pain and grief that had nearly destroyed him. He thought about that night in the snow, about Lydia's scream, about the choice that had seemed so small at the time but had changed everything. Sometimes one decision, one moment of courage or compassion or simple human decency could alter the course of a life, could transform despair into hope, loneliness into love, running into staying. He'd been given a second chance and he'd taken it with both hands. That was enough, more than enough. It was everything. Inside the house, the clock struck 7. Lydia called the children in for dinner. Samuel complained about having to wash his hands. Eliza helped set the table without being asked. The ordinary rituals of family life unfolded as they had 1,000 times before and would 1,000 times again. And Caleb, watching from the doorway, felt a profound sense of gratitude for the gift he'd been given. The gift of home, the gift of love, the gift of staying. He thought about a younger version of himself, angry, broken, convinced that happiness was something that happened to other people. That version would never have believed this life was possible. But here he was, living proof that people could change, that the past didn't have to define the future, that sometimes, against all odds and reason, broken things could be made whole again. He stepped inside, closed the door against the gathering darkness, and joined his family at the table, where he belonged, where he would always belong, because he'd finally learned the most important lesson of all, that true courage wasn't about facing down outlaws or surviving blizzards or fighting impossible odds. True courage was about opening your heart when every scar told you to keep it closed, about building when it was easier to destroy, about staying when every instinct screamed to run. And in the end, that was the story worth telling. Not about the man who saved a life in the snow, but about the man who saved himself by choosing love over fear, by choosing to stay,